Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
As it's nearly Halloween, how about we share some creepy stories? I recently moved in with my grandma. She lives in an old townhouse. It never freaked me out too much as a kid, despite the creaking at night and mysteriously noisy attic. So now I'm a grown-up, this is no big deal. Right? Right. For the first time last week, I'm alone in the house. I'm doing my thing, having breakfast, opening up the blinds, outside, watching some TV and checking Reddit. As I go upstairs, I feel the urge to run up as if being chased by something. Always been like this. Even as a grown-up. Got used to it. I get dressed properly and go back downstairs. As I'm turning into the living room, I freeze. There are 3 chairs lined up against the wall next to the TV. They've always been there, for as long as I can remember. Except one of the chairs is 3 feet away from the others. Still against the wall, but away from the others. Now I'm a skeptic, and my rational mind is suddenly racing to figure out why this chair isn't where I remember it was. I don't like this. Quick check, I'm still alone in the house. That's not a relief. I sit at the table facing that goddamn chair, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe I've moved it and don't remember? House creaks closer inspection, the 2 other chairs actually moved the other way as well, they're not jammed against the TV stand. There's stuff on the floor positively jammed in between the chair legs and TV stand. I would have noticed if I crunched that in there. So, I think. What did I do? I got up, checked around if anyone was here, threw old coffee in the microwave. Opened the blinds in the kitchen. Then in the living room, I remember hearing the microwave beep as I'm outside latching the blinds. And going back in, and drinking it while watching TV, in the living room, facing the chairs, sitting exactly as I'm sitting right now. Then it hits me. The chair is not against the wall, it's against the door. The very door I opened and closed when I opened the blinds. So, I've officially ruled out the chair being there in the first place. It moved. I didn't do it. And no one else is in the house. I don't like this. I still have no idea WTF happened. This happened to me when I was about 6 years old and living with my family in Turkey, Air Force assignment. I woke up in the middle of the night, got out of bed, walked down the hall, and stood in the doorway of my parents' bedroom. I don't remember what woke me up, there was no conscious thought or emotion which propelled me, I could have been sleepwalking but felt awake. In my parents' room I saw them both awake, my father sitting up in bed, and both looking towards the foot of the bed. In front of their bed was a black shape. It looked like a chalk outline of a body which had been scribbled in black. The edges were a little jarring and messy, and the outline was human, but there was no dimension to it, no light reflecting from it, it was just black. Its pose was a little exaggerated, like it had been walking quietly along the floor and was now looking up, caught. I didn't see the front of its face, I don't think anyway, it didn't seem to be looking at me, but I don't think it had any facial features since, aside from the outline, it was featureless. Anyway, my dad says a Mormon priesthood prayer commanding it to leave the house. Full disclosure, I'm ex-Mormon, the prayer was a command in the name of Christ that the entity in the room leave. I don't remember it word for word, but that's the gist, and it flew out the window. It didn't sprout wings or anything, I didn't even see its limbs move, it just became a blur that went out the window. I say flying because it didn't touch the ground as it went. My dad looked at the doorway and said, "Go to bed, girls." I looked up and my older sister, 9, was standing behind me. We went to bed and didn't discuss it. I talked to my mom about it a year ago, though, somewhat convinced that it could have been a dream and that I only woke up at the end when my parents made me go to bed. She says that she and my dad woke up with a terrible, pressing, dark feeling in the room. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in front of them. My dad said a prayer to make it leave, and then they saw us. She never saw anything but felt it strongly, while I never felt anything but saw it. I haven't talked with my sister or dad about it, I don't think they'd want to discuss it. My grandfather's story. When he was just a few years old, he lived with his mother and grandmother. His father had abandoned them when my grandfather was born. Anyways, they lived in a home which had rooms upstairs, but you had to go out the front door of the bottom floor and go up a ladder outside to get to them. He said it was basically like a hay loft and that there wasn't really a door to it, just a sliding piece of wood that went back and forth to cover the entrance. One night, after he had eaten dinner, he went up there to sleep. In the middle of the night, he wakes up to a man trying to get him out of the bed. The man puts him over his shoulder and begins to descend down the ladder, when the front door swings open and out came my grandfather's mother and grandmother. The man drops him and takes off running into the darkness. He was almost kidnapped, but he said he believes it was actually his father coming to take him. When I was little, probably around 8, my brother and I shared a room, he was 5. We had bunk beds, and I was on the bottom. One night I kept hearing scratching under my bed, and I started getting pretty freaked out. Chances are it's just a mouse or something, but I'm an 8-year-old girl, everything is a monster. I try to ignore it and go back to sleep, but it keeps getting louder. I sit up and turn on the light by my bed. Of course, I don't dare look under the bed, but I look around the room. I noticed that my brother's drawer in his dresser was open, and I knew it was closed before we went to bed because even back then I had OCD about doors and cupboards, etc. not being left open. But, no big deal, brother probably got something out of there after I'd fallen asleep and forgot to close it. My grandma makes dolls, she's exceptionally good at it and has made me many over the course of my life. At this point I had about 6 dolls she had made me. I noticed that they were all on the ground, off of their little stands, and that one was missing. I was about to get up and go fix them, but I heard the scratching again and said, "Duck that." I laid back down and heard growling. Of course, the first thing I do is hide under the blankets. Not a minute later, I feel something at my feet, tugging on the blankets. I pull myself into a fetal position and start to cry. I feel whatever it is make its way up my body and I can feel that it is claws because they're puncturing my skin a little bit. It gets to my head and starts trying to tug the blankets off my head. Finally, I screamed and woke up my brother. I feel it jump off of me really fast, digging its claws into me deeper in the process. My brother wakes up and asks what was wrong. I didn't want to freak him out, so I just said I'd had a bad dream. My dad came in to see what was up and bring back my doll that was in the hallway. They're only for display so there is no reason for them to be off the shelf, which is on my brother's dresser, and I told him I'd tell him in the morning so my brother didn't hear any of it. The next morning, I told him exactly what happened, and he said I just had a bad dream and that sometimes people have very real dreams. I now have lucid dreams about 2 to 3 nights a week, until I lift up my shirt. I had deep gashes from where the thing pushed off of me and little puncture wounds all the way up one side. From what I can tell, whatever it was only had 2 toes and a back one, think talons on an eagle or something. To this day I still have no idea what it was. Weirdest part? The doll that had been missing was then found. A dragon with 3 toes, 2 in front and 1 in back. But I'm sure that's a total coincidence. No one ever believes me, but my mom has pictures in her garage somewhere. When I was in 7th or 8th grade, there was a really obnoxious boy in my class. He used to play the penis game during exams and throw spitballs at the teacher. Regular old teenage stuff, but after a while it stopped being funny. After a week from hell, he had faked an earache and stuck a Q-tip down his ear, cut his nose to give himself a bloody nose. We were all tired of his games. We were doing our weekly quizzes and he kept saying swears every 30 seconds. The teacher got tired of it and wanted to go home, so she just let him do it. My friend and I looked at each other then at the boy at the same time. We both saw a demon-like creature with a fork in his hand. When the boy was quiet, the creature was rubbing his back, then the creature stuck the fork in him, and the boy let out a swear. This continued for about 2 minutes, and we were in shock. We ran to the bathroom after class and cried out hearts out. It was a Thursday night, I was in 3rd or 4th grade and my sister was in 1st or 2nd, and we were in the playroom, the room with our TV and PS2 and stuff, just screwing around. Around 8:30, my mom comes downstairs, and I can hear my dad say something to her, and she loudly gasps and says, "Oh my God." Me and my sister wonder what's going on, and we go ask. My dad said a few minutes earlier, a guy walked into our house, literally opened the front door, forgot to lock it, and walked right in. He asked my dad for gas money, and my dad, being a doctor, could tell the man had a mental or psychological problem, so he calmly says he didn't have any and walked him outside. We all go outside, and there were other families standing outside, with a police car walking a man in handcuffs to the car. The police said he had mental problems, stole his dad's van, and drove 50 miles away, before running out of gas. When I was a kid, we lived in a duplex that had bedrooms upstairs. You go up the stairs, right in front of you are 2 bedrooms, and it's either the doorway on the left side, which is my parents' room, or on the right my room. As a kid, in the 1st or 2nd grade, that house always creeped me out at night. I remember lying in bed one time because I could not sleep. The bed faced the doorway. I had a good nightlight, and from the opening I saw a dog, smallish, run past my doorway, which caused me to start crying cause it's late and that's physically not possible. The way it was running meant it would have come out the wall and fled into a wall. I was terrified. And of course, who do parents believe when kids say that stuff? It's a memory I've kept from childhood. Odd and seriously legit. So, the first year, my dorm window overlooked our dining hall building. One night I was by myself in my room when I noticed movement outside my window. I looked outside and saw some sort of huge white creature emerge from the darkness. Keep in mind, my college is in a very populated beach city in CA, so there is never any large wildlife wandering around. It was shaped like a dog, but way too big to be a dog. It was roughly the size of a lion and it had exceptionally long white fur and a long snout. I stared at it wondering what it could possibly be. It kind of moved like a cat. It gracefully climbed the steps leading up to the dining room door and looked around. A few seconds later, it gracefully descended the steps and slipped back into the darkness. After it disappeared, I stood there completely frozen, not sure what I had just witnessed. I kept staring at the spot it disappeared, hoping it would reappear again just to make sure I saw what I saw. I ran to tell my suite mates, but everyone thought I was weird and just saw a stray dog, but I swear in my life it looked nothing like a dog. To this day, it still gives me shivers thinking about it. 2 years ago, I decided to have a movie night on Halloween. I was living with my mom at the time, and she was against the holiday for religious reasons. Anyway, I headed out to the nearest Blockbuster, picked out a few horror flicks, and headed to the counter. The only person working at the time was a young woman, roughly about my age, late teens. Nobody else was in the store, as I had anticipated, so I began asking her questions about Halloween to make small talk. I asked what she was doing working on a holiday, rather than spending it at a party or something. This was her reply: "I don't like Halloween." When I was 4 years old, I went trick-or-treating with my mom. Sometime around 10 p.m., a man approached me and stabbed me for no apparent reason. At this point, she pointed to her wrist, which indeed looked badly scarred. She continued, "My mother and I managed to yell loud enough for people to catch some attention, so we got away." Later the next day, after I was treated for injuries, we found out the man was a child murderer, and had killed 3 other young children that same night. Needless to say, I didn't know how to respond. Creepiest story ever. One night, me and my friend decided to go for a walk. We went for a walk because he doesn't really like to play video games. He's more of a talker, and yes, he's gay. Anyway, he wanted to go for a walk, and I was like, "You whatever man, let's go." Now a little backstory on my friend: he's wicked, sorry spelling. And he says that he has some sort of connection with the spirit world. Sounds like a whole lot of bull on my part, but I don't really care about what people believe in. It's not my place to disregard someone because of their beliefs. I don't really have any belief in spiritual, but I don't go to church or anything. So anyway, we go on this walk, and then we start heading back to my place. When all of a sudden it gets hard to breathe, and some sort of pressure is all around us. I am not seeing out of my eyes anymore. It's as if I was seeing through something else's eyes behind us. I can see me and my friend walking, in a third-person view. But I could hear hard breathing that didn't sound human, and I noticed that whatever was behind us was getting closer to us fast, almost sprinting. I am seeing through this being's eyes, looking at me and my friend. When all of a sudden I start praying, something I never do. I recited some prayers about Michael the Archangel. Something I don't know, never heard it before, but my body just sort of said it. By the end of the prayer, I could finally see through my eyes again. I looked at my friend and asked, "Did you feel that? Did you see that?" He replied, "I felt it. It was some sort of evil, but it's gone now. I don't know what happened that night, but me and my friend have not talked about that night since." When I was in college, I had 3 friends that lived together. All female. One night, one of them caught a guy staring in her window. They called the police, and a patrol was started in the area regularly. It was a college town. A few weeks later, a different roommate heard heavy breathing outside her window. She pulled up the shade to see a man's face, and he quickly said "I love you" before disappearing. This is strange, because her bedroom window is about 8 feet off the ground, and there is nothing to stand on / any marks where they could have placed something to stand on. After both of these things happened and the perp was not caught, the girls bought some blunt, heavy swords at a yard sale for a few bucks, and kept them in various places around the house. After a few weeks, it appeared all was well, and everyone began to let their guard down. One night, everyone was sitting around drinking. Suddenly, the door handle began to rattle. However, all of the roommates and expected guests were already there. Naturally, everyone dashed for the swords, and brandished them by the door. The door opened, and in stumbled a drunk college kid. He turned white and looked scared, understandably so, and began apologizing profusely for stumbling into the wrong house. The culprit for the peeping was never found. When I was younger, about 16, a group of bored friends and I were hanging out, when one of the guys told us about this really creepy guy that lives about 45 minutes out of town. We decided to go investigate. We drove down this dirt road, full of bumps, without curbs, in the dark, for a good 20 minutes, with no houses on sight. I didn't think much of it, just thought, oh, what, an abandoned house. When we saw a hand-painted sign that read "Slow 5 mph" in poor handwriting, hand painting, we slowed, turned off the lights, and what I saw made me want to cry. There was a large, run-down house a good 50 yards away, surrounded by trees. In every single tree there were dolls hanging by their necks, a good 10 or so for each tree. Some dolls were tied around the trunk, some with eyes removed, clothes tattered, painted with blood. We saw a man open the door with a shotgun, which is when we took off, crying with fear. Rumor has it, if you're not fast enough, he'll shoot out your tires. I'm not sure what happens then, I don't want to know. It was so scary. Last year, I lived by myself in a condominium with my dog. She was a miniature American Eskimo that was an absolute sweetheart. Normally, she would always stay near me, either to play or just nap near my feet. One night, she wandered off into my living room and started a low growl directed at my front door. Hearing this, I went over to her and tried to get her to stop. Nope. I stood in front of her to block her view, and she would just sidestep, never taking her eyes off the front door. I checked it out, went outside and looked around, nothing. She would do this sporadically. Every week or so, for months. Of course, I told my friends about this, and people figured there must have been a dog or other animal outside. One time we had a lot of people over, and everyone was hanging out in the living room. My dog was in attention and would just try to get everyone to pet/cuddle her. All of a sudden, she just stares straight at the front door and starts growling. We check, nothing out there. Worth mentioning that I had never heard or seen my dog growl at anything before that. She passed away last December, while we were back at my parents' place for the holidays, so I never did figure out what was freaking her out. This was my friend's story, but she does not go on Reddit, so I will tell it. My friend's sister went alone on a camping trip a couple of miles out of town, so she was not terribly far away from civilization, but far enough where there might be an occasional mountain lion or coyote. She was planning to stay out there by herself for a few nights, so the first day everything was perfect. The tranquility of being by yourself in nature with no other people or machines about everywhere. She had a disposable camera that she took and took a whole bunch of pictures. She set up camp and spent a couple of days in the wilderness. She had a wonderful time and was eager to see the pictures she took and to see how they turned out. She started to look through the pictures when she stopped on this one photo. It was a picture taken of her sleeping in her sleeping bag. I was about 15 in Wildwood, New Jersey. It was about 12:30 a.m. and me, my sister, her friends and mine were just sitting on the lifeguard chair when a girl of about 30 walked up to us. She wasn't weird, just seemed a little spaced out. She talked to us for a minute about how beautiful the ocean was and how she used to come here every year. Then she starts asking us all to go swimming. Everyone said no. It was chilly and late at night. Then she just walked in and disappeared. We sat and watched, and she never came out. We sat there for an hour, and no one ever came out. We called the police officers, and nothing ever came of it. One night I had a nightmare. It freaked me out to the point where I woke up. Well, I woke up, got my bearings, and calmed down because I realized it had all been just a dream. Just then I felt a presence in the room. It traveled up my bed and hovered over my neck. I couldn't talk, I couldn't breathe. For about 10 seconds, then suddenly it left, and I could talk. I started freaking out just a bit, and my mother came upstairs to find out what was wrong. 1 week later I woke up again to a nightmare, and the moment I had woke up I heard and felt my Adam's apple being bitten, again freaked out just a bit, and my mom heard me and came upstairs. I've never had it happen since. I don't do drugs or drink, and I consider myself a very logical individual. My friend's parents had bought a really rundown house for cheap with the intention of fixing it up. They'd done it with another house before with relatively good luck, so I guess they were feeling pretty ambitious with this house. It was out in the country, and the previous owner was apparently kind of a shut-in aside from going out to hunt. From what I remember, my friend's parents bought the house in as-is condition, meaning that the bank, or whoever, didn't do any cleaning or removed any of the previous owner's stuff after he died. I don't know if he died in the house or not, but it wouldn't have surprised me. The house was in really bad condition, completely unlivable. The previous owner was a hoarder, and never threw anything away. The basement, outbuildings, and every room in the house was packed floor to ceiling with garbage and random stuff. Unsettling but not creepy, so far. So, my friend's parents enlisted my brother and I to help cart out the trash from the house. It was like a bizarre archaeological dig. As we cleared stuff out, the bottom layers were compacted and more decayed than the stuff on top. It didn't smell much because it was all pretty dried out. However, once we started clearing out the basement, it was obvious there was more than just garbage down there. We found 3 old, unplugged refrigerators stuffed with the now mummified remains of animals. Cats, dogs, ducks, geese, turkeys, lots of older stuff we couldn't recognize. Some of them were wrapped in plastic, others in newspapers. The game animals weren't processed like he'd ever had the intention of eating them. Either it was like he was killing, or finding, them and just putting them straight in the refrigerators. We cleared out everything down to the bare earth floor, except it wasn't really a dirty floor, it was just stuff that had decomposed down to dirt. We started a 5-gallon bucket brigade to clean out the dirt and in the process unearthed about a dozen cat skeletons. After several weeks of this, my friend's dad fixed the staircase so we, the kids, could safely go up and downstairs to the 2nd floor. My friend excitedly showed me what was to be her bedroom. It was pretty big, with a picture window facing out towards the woods. There was graffiti spray painted all over the walls and holes in the drywall. The holes were stuffed with dirty underwear. That night was the first night Anna slept in her bedroom, and a pheasant flew through the glass of the picture window and landed in her bed. Her dad rushed in when he heard her screaming and broke its neck. I vowed never to sleep in that house, and never did. I was home alone, visiting college. We have a door to our guest room that emits a very noticeable creaking noise when you open or close it. I step out of my bathroom that is down the hall after showering, and I hear the creak. I jump out of my skin and back into the bathroom, locking the door. I think through some options, and I decide to wait a minute and listen for more sounds. I keep looking at the bottom of my bathroom door. Note the height of the carpet in the hall disallows me to see if there are people standing in front of the door. It will allow a small shadow to be visible, however, if something is blocking the hall light. And there was one. I was scared. No phone, only a towel around my waist. I choose the brave route and take the towel rack bizarre, 2.5-inch diameter metal rod, and work up the balls to throw my door open and assault whatever is outside my bathroom. My cat then meowed loudly from the other side of the door. I had been scared by my own cat. I examined the guest room door. You can push it open without turning the doorknob. One night when I was 14 or 15 years old, I was in my bed trying to fall asleep. Eventually, I was in a sort of half-asleep half-awake state. I was sleeping on my stomach and started to feel a pressure on my back along with the voice of a woman whispering things into my ear. The woman's voice was so soothing, and I can't recall what she said, but they were pleasant things. I was in a sort of trance, lulled by this siren's voice. At a certain point, I was like, wait a minute, this is odd. I immediately tried to get up and out of bed, but my body was completely paralyzed, everything except for my eyes. I couldn't move a muscle for around 10 to 15 seconds, then I shot up like a bullet. I was so freaked out that I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. I believed in the paranormal until I took AP psychology in high school. Apparently, this is a common symptom of something called sleep paralysis. It's when you're awake, but your body thinks you are in REM sleep, which completely paralyzes your body. It's not exactly a paranormal story, but without the proper context, it feels as though you were just possessed by a demon. My little brother and I grew up in a national park in Wyoming. Absolute middle of nowhere. Whenever we got home from elementary school, we would be alone for about 2 to 3 hours until my parents got home. Normally, not a big deal. One day when we came home, I happened to look down at the hall and noticed by the light in my parents' room was on. Right then, my little brother made a noise, dropping his backpack or something. About a second later, I saw a hand quickly hit the light switch. The room was down the hall on the right side, so I could only see into the room at a really limited angle. I got my brother and told him to be really quiet. I grabbed a hammer, and he grabbed some plastic baseball bat, and we started sneaking down the hall. A few feet into this, my 9-year-old self realized this was probably a really bad idea. We returned to the living room, where I quietly tried to call my mom at work. Instead, I got her boss. I told her that someone was in the house, and she instructed me to go next door to a neighbor I knew was home. My brother went over there, then watched as a lot of law enforcement rangers showed up to our house with guns drawn, and slowly went inside. About 5 minutes later, they came over to the house to let our neighbor know what was going on. When they went into the house, they went to my parents' room. The screen was out of the window. They then asked if either my brother or I had taken a knife out and left it in the kitchen. Turns out they found some bias butcher knife lying on the floor. It really didn't strike me as scary at the time, but looking back on it, no, I'm creeped out by it. Sometime after the Second World War, my grandfather was selling a little real estate on the side to make ends meet. With 7 mouths to feed, he'd take just about any listing he could get. One of his listings in particular had been on the market for some time, and for good reason. Now, my grandfather, a God-fearing Irish Catholic, didn't believe in much supernatural nonsense, but his house changed all that. He sold the house to a veteran. His family consisted of a new German bride, and a son from a previous marriage. When they were viewing the house, the boy would leave the group to explore, but would soon return to ask my grandfather who the other man was. My grandfather thought it was a game and would assure the boy there wasn't anyone else in the house. But the boy persisted enough that his father eventually hit him. Well, it turned out the other man didn't like that very much. 2 weeks after having moved in, my grandfather received a call from the veteran begging my grandfather to come over immediately. When my grandfather arrived, the man was on the ground floor of the house, sitting on a couch made up as a makeshift bed. He was pale and covered in sweat. As my grandfather recalls, the rings around his eyes made it look as if he hadn't slept at all in those 2 weeks. The veteran told my grandfather he was willing to pay him $5,000, late 40s dollar US, to spend the night, and see what has been happening to him every night since they moved in. The veteran was not allowed to sleep upstairs. The veteran refused to be left alone, and the boy was never touched again. Naturally, my grandfather put on his hat, and made his way to the door immediately. I still drive past the house every now and again, just to see if I can catch a glimpse of the other man. Happened when I was a kid. 3 of my friends were over my house and we were telling scary stories, one of which was the infamous Bloody Mary, where you can conjure her spirit through your bathroom mirror by closing the bathroom door, shutting the lights, holding a lit candle upside down, and chanting Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, over and over again while staring into the mirror. I go into the bathroom with a friend, and we follow all the instructions. About 15 Bloody Marys in, the fire on the candle goes out. There was no reason it would've, because it was brand new and one of those long-stemmed dinner table types. A second after the light goes out, my friend shrieks at the top of her lungs, so I, completely freaked out, try to open the bathroom door. My bathroom door had no lock, and while I was trying to open the door in a state of panic, the door wouldn't open. It didn't feel like I was trying to open a locked door, it would give a little and pull back, as if someone were on the other side trying to hold it shut. I finally broke through after maybe 5 seconds of struggle, and both of us stumbled out, her in a state of hysterical crying. I expected my friends to be right outside the door laughing their asses off, but I see them in my living room a good 40 feet down the hall, sitting in front of the TV playing Super Nintendo, their eyes fixated on the screen in uninterrupted video gaming mode. I never really bought into the idea of ghosts and whatnot, being non-religious. I kind of have a tough time justifying the whole thing. I was raised that way. And then when I was about 16 years old, my stepbrother, who lived in this little basement room, not like a creepy dungeon, it was actually developed and pretty nice, died. He was 19 years old. From that day on, there was a whole bunch of little weird things that would happen, but this one I think takes the cake. When I was about 18 years old, my parents went on vacation for a week, leaving my older sister in charge. We had converted my stepbrother's basement room into a computer room. There was no door, and we had a washer, dryer and freezer lined up right next to it. My sister Nicole and I had run a few errands and came home around 8:30 p.m. to an obviously empty house. She walks into the kitchen, and I beeline down the stairs, through the kitchen, to the computer room. So, I am typing away probably on MySpace or LiveJournal or something gay like that. And I hear a loud bang off of the washer machine, followed by a quite agitated Nicole yelling down their stairs, "Take that, you little man!" She had thrown an empty rigid plastic pretzel container down the stairs, and it hit the washing machine. Confused as to why I'm being scolded, I ask her what I did. She informs me that I snuck up the stairs and threw the container at her when she was at the sink, her back being to the door. But the joke was on me because I hit the dishwasher. I assure her that I did no such thing. The container was sitting on the counter next to the door, and I asked her if maybe it fell. Now, this counter wasn't right next to the sink, it was across the room, on the opposite wall. I ask, maybe it fell off the counter and rolled? But she was insistent that it impacted with considerable force. At this point, we were both thoroughly creeped out, considering all of the other weird things that had happened. So, we broke up, she spent the night with her boyfriends, and I took a walk. When I got home, the house was empty, and I thought I would do an experiment, so I set the container on the table, and went to bed. In the morning, it was standing upright on the floor in front of the front door. The house was still empty. Not sure how this rate, but it was creepy as hell at the time. And I'm full of these stories, so let me know if you want more. 1990, when I was around 8, and my dad still being in the English Army, posted in Germany at the time, we had this rather large flat. From what I've been told, we stayed there for at least a year without a single problem or weird occurrence. That is, until just after Boxing Day in 1990. For Christmas, my dad had given me quite a large stack of random books as I'd taken interest in reading. Anyway, that night while trying to fall asleep, I heard some eerily weird noise. To this day, if anything sounds the same, I tense up. It seems somewhat like a soft knock. As if you'd wrap a cloth around your fist and bang on a door. Regardless, I listened to it continuously for an hour or so. So naturally, as a young lad, I went to look. Found nothing, so went back to bed. Next day I explained what I heard. And as most people would, my parents simply dismissed it as a dream. Fast forward to that night and the same exact thing happens. I yet again go check and find nothing, so wanting to prove myself I go into my parents' room to wake them up. They both come sitting on my bed with the lights off and door closed. While waiting. I guess it's something like 10 minutes later when my mom starts reassuring me nothing will happen, an amazingly loud noise just comes from around the door with a few thuds of falling objects following shortly after. My mom understandably almost snaps my arm in fear, and my dad just sits there while slowly turning pale. From this part on, I sadly can't remember anything, but this is what my parents told me happened after the thud. Apparently my mom started screaming like she'd just witnessed a murder, which in turn prompted the neighbors to come round. Fearing something awful would happen, they tried to break the doors down. According to my parents, it took my neighbors, about 4 to 5 able-bodied squad guys, about 15 minutes to break the door down and get to us. Why might you ask? Books had been piled up in front and or behind of every single door. Apparently some of the books I had been gifted with were seen, and the rest of them my parents swear to this day they have no clue where they could have come from. To this day, my mother does not shut any doors in the house, except front door, and I cannot recall books being gifted at all since then. Okay, so this is true. I was at my granddad's house many years ago and he was taking his wallet out of his back pocket. He was old and carried a comb in his pocket, and when he took his wallet out, the comb fell on the floor. Stick with me, we're almost there. When the comb landed on the floor, vinyl tile stuff, it landed with the teeth pointing up. Like the thing just fell 3 feet and landed perfectly in a standing up position. It took considerable effort for me to just balance the comb that way, but it fell out of his pocket and physics handled the rest. Freaky. When I was younger, my family and I used to go to New York to visit my grandparents when I was on break from school. We would go every summer, and sometimes we visited for a week in the winter around Christmas, which is when this story takes place. I remember nothing from this trip except this. My grandparents used to live in upstate New York. Their house was really close to the Saratoga battlefield, close enough to where fighting probably happened on their property. Me, my dad, mom, and sister were out one night, and as we were on our way back we decided to drive on the road that leads through the battlefield, in hopes of seeing deer. So here we were, driving through the battlefield in the middle of the night, where countless people have died. We are probably in the middle of the battlefield when we spot someone waving us down. At first, we figured that it was probably someone broken down up the road, and on their way back to the ranger for help, but as we got closer we saw it was an old woman. She is dressed in an old woolen pink shirt, and she is flagging us down in the middle of the deserted battlefield in the middle of the night. She isn't really on the road, but off in the grass maybe 25 to 35 yards. After probably begging my dad not to stop, we turned around to drive to the ranger's office for help. The ranger gets in his truck and follows us to the spot where we saw the woman. He shines a spotlight into the field and sees nothing. He goes up and down the road away and sees nothing. She's gone. There is only field which we can see with a light, woods, and road. Nowhere to go. Gone. That night I did not sleep and was paralyzed with fear. I remember lying in bed knowing that if I were to look out of the window, she would be in the backyard staring up at me. To this day, I contend that I saw a ghost that night. I still get chills by just typing this story. When I was about 5 years old, my father bought these wooden decorative clogs. He says there was something off about the woman on the street that he got them from, but he ignored his intuition and saw them as a great deal. He placed them on the top shelf of the entertainment system in the living room, next to the couch that he slept on. At the time my parents weren't sleeping in the same bed. That same night, my older half-brother was staying over, too, and slept on the couch adjacent to my dad's. We all went to sleep as normal. In the middle of the night, we heard my dad groaning, and my brother let out a scream. My mom and I ran into the living room and saw my dad being strangled by his sheets and slowly being raised off the couch. We put the lights on, and everything stopped. We were all flipping and had no idea what had just happened. Later that day, my dad gave the clogs to my grandma, who insisted that they were too nice to throw out, so took them regardless of what we had experienced with them earlier. A couple of weeks later she contacted us about the clogs and says that every night that she kept them in her living room, she would hear footsteps up and down the hallway and loud bangs on her bedroom door. She lives in an apartment building in the South Bronx, a truly dangerous neighborhood, and has gated windows, 5 locks on her front door, and keeps her bedroom locked at night. Whenever she left her room to check if anyone had broken in, there was nothing. We have no idea what happened with the clogs after my grandma chucked them, but to this day my dad still has nightmares of being choked. TLDR, haunted clogs choked my dad in his sleep and harassed my grandma during the night when I was a kid. When I was 2.5, my grandmother died of lung cancer. The night she died, I was asleep in my room. My mom got a phone call from my aunt, giving her the sad news. 10 minutes later, I woke up crying, and when my mom came in the room and asked what was wrong, she said, "Grammy went to live with the angels." I'd always kind of taken this story with a grain of salt, like maybe it could have been something my mom exaggerated because she was emotional or whatever. But 17 years later when my grandfather died, the night before he died I dreamt he and I were in a red 1960 Cadillac Eldorado cruising down a road in the middle of the desert in New Mexico. The next day when I found out he died and I went to the hospital, I told my mom, and she said he'd mentioned a few times that he'd always wanted to drive a convertible down Route 66. Not really a Halloween story, but it's something I've experienced that I can't explain. And I still get choked up thinking about riding in the caddy with my grandfather. About 3 years ago, I used to work front desk at a hotel, pretty nice, not too shabby. Next to the front desk area of the hotel are the two offices for the manager and the assistant manager. The manager's office has windows, the assistant manager's office does, not just one way in one way out. One day I came in as normal, and my manager asked me if anyone came in at night like our handyman of the hotel who also has a universal key, and I said no. Well, it turns out one morning we were unable to get in the assistant manager's office because the desk was blocking the door. Think about this, a good 40-60-pound desk with no windows and the door opens inward with a computer/picture/ and paperwork on top of the desk. Moved in front of the door. There is no way to leave a desk right next to a door without having someone pushing it from the other side. One thing that I also found kind of creepy is the hotel is located next to a small cemetery. You can go out and walk to it in less than 10 steps from one of the doors of the hotel. Sometimes I would also hear at night at the end of my shift, doors opening as an alarm goes off in the front desk area when someone opens doors at the furthest areas, and I would see the security camera, and no one went in or out. Even on windy days, the doors would not make sounds only when opened. In 1985, there was a big flood in my hometown. Mom, being the kind soul that she is, allowed a friend and her husband to move downstairs in our duplex until they could get their own place again. Well, they didn't have flood insurance, so it took a while. Mom's friend and her husband were always there when I was growing up, and they treated me like I was the child they had never been able to have. She was a teacher at the same school as my mom, he was a Baptist minister. We never thought anything of leaving me alone with either of them if Mom and Dad had to run out and do errands. Eventually, the husband's behavior got a little erratic and they bought the house next door, having finally saved up enough after 16 or so years. Not long after they got divorced. A couple of weeks after that, the now ex-husband broke into our external stairway to our basement and hid there and assaulted his ex-wife. She managed to get into our house and call the police officers. So of course, they interviewed my parents since he had hidden on our property, but the lock was in trouble to the external stairwell, so they knew we weren't at fault. We figured that would be the end of things. I came home a few weeks later and there were men in suits talking to my parents. Dad got up and came to the door, giving me some money and telling me to go to the movies. When I came back the men in suits were gone. It turned out that Marion had never been a Baptist minister. He'd walked off a prison work party down south and been lying to his ex-wife and to my parents the entire time he'd lived in the state. This didn't happen to me, so I don't tell the story very well and I may have a couple details off, but I always found this a little creepy. It's really out there, so I don't blame you if you don't believe it. I do simply because I know the guy it happened to very well and he's extremely skeptical. A friend of mine, Brian, used to do investigations with a couple of other people. They were very skeptical and would never assume anything they couldn't explain was a ghost. They'd just say, well, there's something going on here we can't explain, and leave it at that. They very seldom got a case that even ended in that. A couple friends of Brian's kept bugging him to check out their apartment because they had apparently made several contacts on a Ouija board and kept having weird things happen around the place, doors shutting randomly, stuff falling off counters. Of course, Brian's first reaction was a Ouija board? You've got to be kidding me. However, his friend was really insistent and finally he went to check it out. Brian had the guys use the Ouija board and they contacted several different spirits or whatever you want to call them. One of them spoke Spanish, which intrigued Brian because none of the guys spoke Spanish. The building the apartment was in used to be a hotel, and across from the apartment was a closed-off hallway where all the rooms used to be. Brian, still skeptical but curious, took the Ouija board and some equipment into the hallway. Supposedly he had several long, confusing conversations with several different entities. All of the entities expressed fear of one called CZ, and when Brian asked why they'd be very cryptic about it. Eventually one of the entities told Brian to search room 8, when he asked what he would find, it answered CZ. So, Brian goes to room 8, breaks down the door, and finds a whole bunch of scribbling on the wall. The only legible markings are Making Howlers and Chuck Solner. Through a mix of Ouija conversations and inquiries at the Historical Society, Brian discovered that Chuck had killed someone in the hotel in the late 1800s. Chuck died in another state, but supposedly hid the murder weapon in the hotel. As for the Making Howlers thing, when he mentioned it to the entities he only got fearful responses and no answers. Another entity he contacted, Beth, claimed to be 19 years old and thought it was still the late 1800s early 1900s. After some research, Brain discovered a girl named Elizabeth had been run over by a stagecoach in front of the hotel. On Brian's last visit to the hotel, he could only get a hold of one entity, one he'd never had contact with, and it kept saying, "I'm trying to kill you," etc., etc. Then a really strong, foul odor entered the room, the candle he had with him started burning sideways, and Brian decided it was best to leave. A couple of weeks later, Brian was talking to a supposed psychic and out of nowhere she said, "You've been getting into things lately, haven't you? You really need to clean that stuff of you." She told him some spirit named Elizabeth had attached itself to him. We tried to gain access to the hotel a couple of years ago, but Brian's friends moved out, meaning we couldn't get in the building, and the new owner didn't want us poking around. I really wish I could have checked that place out, just to see what it was all about. I had just moved into my new apartment and had a friend over as well as my roommate being home. My roommate was in the shower and I was playing beautiful Katamari and being a bad host by completely ignoring my friend when someone walked right through the living room and into my kitchen. They were wearing brown and I could hear them walk across the hardwood as well as feel that breeze that happens when someone walks by you in close proximity. It was so real that I didn't even bother to take a second look. I just assumed it was my roommate getting out of the shower and going into the kitchen. My friend paused for about 30 seconds and then had a whole "what was that?" moment, and I just said it was probably my roommate, and he said he had thought the same thing, but he could still hear her in the shower. I went and knocked on the bathroom door and indeed she was all soapy and showery. It was so real that the three of us immediately searched the house high and low to see if some fourth person we didn't know was in the apartment. A couple of other things happened to me while I was living there, but the only other one worth mentioning was I came home one night and sat on my futon, and right as I sat down I felt the very distinct feeling of someone pressing up from underneath the couch. I had to get up and check to make sure my roommate wasn't laying under the couch trying to scare me. Stranger things have happened in that apartment. I had let out a little scream when the initial couch pushing had happened, and he came out of his room as I was checking under the couch. I used to live in Laredo, Texas, and I remember I was dating a guy who lived on one of the far-out community ranches. This particular one was really close to the river and border. He used to tell me stories of when he would go camping out on the trails, and one day he finally opened up and began telling me all the weird stuff that started happening to him out there and why he never really wanted to take me out there. He told me the story of these black figures with yellow eyes that he once saw with his friend. He even told me he had made a map of the trails that was one day taken from his room. He said he never knew who took it. Of course, I never believed him until I heard a similar story from other people who lived in the area and on campus. Now I had never had a problem. Sure, I'd see things that were a little strange, and I always had this weird feeling since I moved there. It was almost like this ugly, hateful feeling I would get just driving around. Then one night we were being, well, a couple and hanging out in the car, driving around the ranch, and I hit something. It sounded like I had maybe hit a dog or a cat, which was devastating for me because I always prided myself on never doing something like that. He was going to get out of the car, something could be heard banging underneath us and shaking the car. My first reaction was to make sure the doors were locked and drive backwards. I didn't care what it was. I would like to throw it out there. We were driving around the newer homes that were still under construction. We could hear the thing bouncing underneath us, and I kid you not, my headlights caught a glimpse of the thing. He called them burrow weights, and they look like this. Not exactly, but it's the best way to describe it. Like I said, it wasn't exactly like this, but it's how I describe it when I tell the story. It was weird cause it looked at us with those yellow eyes I always wrote off as belonging to deer, then it looked like it shrugged and took off running like a human-sized cat dressed in a cloak. I probably would say it was a cougar or something if it didn't like skip, jump, climb onto a rooftop, then look back, scream, and join another one that pulled itself out of the window of one of the new houses. I cried. A week later, I was staying at his house, and he said he heard something in the kitchen. He walked out and I watched him turn the light, then look back at me and say, "I'm going to go to the restroom." I was cool with it. I mean, who's going to deny a man the restroom? About a minute after I heard the door to the restroom close, the lights went out and something began to bang on the window of his room. I began to scream my head off and I could hear him trying to open the bathroom door. The lights came back on, and he began to yell, "Hey, come let me out." I couldn't move, and when I finally got the balls to inch towards the edge of the bed, the lights went out again, and this time, the front door and back door sounded like it was going to come off its hinges. That was when his door began to growl and bark its head off. When that happened, the lights came back on, and my ex came running into the room. From this moment on, I began to even see these eyes peering out from the fence that separated my apartment complex from this other ranch I lived nearby. It was weird because during this time I got into 2 really bad accidents, one of which left me severely injured, that I have to say were very much my fault, but when I look back I kept realizing how I shouldn't have survived either of them. Each time after the accidents I would hear weird noises outside the apartment window. It was like scratching and screaming. I got a dog after the last accident, and one night he was too terrified to go outside for the restroom, and he kept wanting to not sleep in the room with me and my sister. This little dog is normally fearless, but for some reason he would cry and shake whenever the lights went out at the complex. He hated to go to my ex's house, and the lady, who we got him from and who lived down the street, said he would cry and whine when they had power outages. When that happened, she said, he would refuse to go outside and would hide under the bed. I found out a few months later that the whole city was originally built on 4 ranches and that these people were not saints. The one where my ex lived was built on a ranch owned by these people who would shoot Native Americans and cross immigrants whenever he could. The owner even built fences as perfect lockouts from his house so he could sit on the porch and fire at them. He managed to talk to the owner of the area I lived in to do the same. My ex told me other stories about weird things he'd seen on the trails that at first I never believed in, but after all this, I never wanted to be caught outside in that ranch after dark. I always felt like I was being watched when I was. I don't live there anymore, and although I have had many weird encounters, this one had to be the most extreme because it wasn't just mine or my ex's story, it flooded into tons of corresponding stories other people had had. I lived in a relatively small town when I was younger, but 20 or 30 minutes outside of town it was all woods, dirt roads, and houses spread out really far from each other. There was, and probably still is, a network of dirt roads that went through the woods that connected local landmarks and people's property. They weren't regular dirt roads in the sense the city or county planned and maintained them, they were just sort of paths through the woods that wound around the ponds and thicker sections of forest. If you had a decent truck you could get to most places you wanted to go without having to be on the main roads. Great for avoiding police officers, but it took a lot longer. One road had an old, abandoned house off of it. Nothing weird, the lady that lived there died and the property went to her sons that lived out of state and hated each other. They never cooperated to sell it, and no one took care of it. One night me and a friend were driving down this road at 4 in the morning after a party. We're chatting, bouncing along in the truck in the absolute backwoods darkness when we drive past the abandoned house. It looks creepy like normal, but it's always been there, so we think nothing of it. We turn past a group of trees, and it happens. Our headlights reveal a middle-aged man, balding but with long hair and dark circles under his eyes, with the 3-day growth of a beard. He's pushing a wheelchair with an old lady wearing a white bathrobe. In the middle of nowhere. In the forest. With ground too bumpy and muddy for a car to get through, he's pushing this elderly woman in a wheelchair. In winter. It takes maybe a full second to get past them, but we pass within a foot or 2 of them. The old lady just keeps staring ahead with her hands folded in her lap. But the guy stares at us, turning his head to keep looking right into the passenger window as we drive past. The only thing I could think after that was that I hoped he couldn't see me. We get past them, and as I look in the side view mirror he's stopped pushing her and is staring back at us. We started to laugh and freak out a bit, saying stuff like, "Holy man, huh, that was something crazy. How weird was that?" We thought it was really oddly funny at first, probably nerves. Then it settled in that we actually saw something really inexplicable. We got silent. I kept thinking about him looking into the passenger window as we passed, into where I was sitting. I started silently wishing to the man, if you pretend we weren't there I promise to pretend you weren't there. If you forget I was there I'll never say you were there. I do that from time to time, renewing my mental promise to him, in case he thought I'd become a loose end to tie up. Until tonight. Tonight, I've told someone. Tonight, I told you. Me and a mate, about 12, playing in an orchard. The story goes, a kid sheltered there during storm, the tree he stood next to exploded when struck by lightning. He dies. Anyway, we were picking apples and suddenly stones started flying at us, thought it was other kids. But no. Ran like billion. Lived in the same house all my life until I left home in my early 20s, for the last 4 or 5 years I would hear the back door rattle at 10:45 p.m. every night. My siblings had heard the same thing. I would wait with the upstairs window slightly open to see what it was, nothing. Possibly the world's worst ghost. Or a cat. Went on cub camp in local woods, stood in a clearing, at night, shone my torch around saw a dark figure of a man stood amongst trees, shouted, "Hello, I can see you." Called a mate over who shone his torch, he confirmed it, called one of the leaders over, it had gone, boo-hoo. Okay, last one, my sister used to work in a mail order shop based in some old stables. The owner's wife headed off home one evening. To do so she descended the stairs, she passed a man in overalls coming up the stairs, he did not acknowledge her. When she got to the bottom she looked up and saw the man still climbing the stairs. Where there were no stairs. Turns out there used to be stairs there when it was stables, which was hundreds of years ago. A couple of years ago, I was going to college in Vincennes, Indiana. So naturally in a small town, you get bored and go looking for stuff to do. Well, one day my friend told me he found a creepy building and wanted to show me. Oh boy. Well, it was nestled on the top of a hill surrounded by trees. It was 4 stories including a basement. At the top was a smokestack that was similar to a furnace used to burn bodies. It was boarded up, but the back entrance was broken in. We decided to go inside. Inside we found all kinds of construction equipment, just sitting there abandoned. It was pretty much trashed, and we walked around on the first floor a bit before leaving. We had a school function to attend, but before we left I found a plaque laying in a corner of one of the rooms. I've still got it, it says operating room equipment donated by Gamma Zeta chapter of Kappa Vincennes. As we left my friend was quiet. Eventually he says, "Did you feel something in there?" No. Why? I felt as if someone was pulling on the hairs of my arms. Creepy, yes. But nothing too big. That's when we decided to research the building. We went to the historical library, and I researched this building. This is its history. In the 1940s it was built as a hospital to treat tuberculosis. It was actually a very revered hospital, well known for giving great care. In fact, the head doctor from Waverly Hills moved to Vincennes to manage this hospital. His old house is across from the old hospital. In the 1960s when TB was cured, it became a school for the mentally handicapped. Then after the law about segregation, it sat vacant until some local offices were run out of the building in the 90s. Then, one night a firefighter who was also a pyromaniac set a fire in the building, just on the strangest whim. The fire didn't do too much damage, but the smoke ruined everything electrical. In the basement of the building the local food pantry was run. Days after the fire, the elderly man in charge of the food pantry was frantically trying to scavenge anything useful, and people said he was extremely distressed. While making a trip down the stairs he tripped, hit his head, and subsequently died. So yes, kind of creepy stuff. Until I dug further. It's not so much the hospital, but the ground the hospital was built on. Hillcrest they call it, but it had another name before the hospital. Before the hospital was a simple shed, where they kept digging equipment. What for? Well, to dig graves for the countless people who were dying from TB. None of the graves were marked, and the bodies were kept there to keep other people from getting infected. Hundreds of bodies are buried under the hospital on that hill, all unmarked. Me and my friend went into the hospital again at night a week later. We dabbled on the first floor then went into the basement, and when I found the body incinerator and an underground tunnel going into the hill my gut twisted, I froze from an unfamiliar feeling and extreme fright. I told him we had to go, and so we did. I'd never felt that terrified in my life. Is it haunted? I don't know, it could be. It sure got the potential. And all this in a town that hardly knows it exists, a forgotten horror. When I was young, my family went on a long car trip from the Midwest, down to Texas, out to California, and then back through the mountains in Colorado. We were in a small town in Arizona, and we found out that there was a lake with a public beach. We went there and set up a blanket on the sand and ate supper while the sun went down. As it got dark, there was some yelling down at the other end of the beach, and a couple of teenagers came sprinting down the beach calling for the lifeguard. My dad spoke up because he had been a lifeguard during college. My mom and dad told my brother and me to stay on the blanket and not go anywhere. They stayed for a long time at the other end of the beach, and when they came back, my mom was crying, and my dad was drying off with a borrowed towel. Years later, I found out that 2 teenagers had drowned, and my dad had to swim at the bottom of this muddy lake, in pitch dark, until he found the bodies of these 2 drowned kids by feeling around in the mud. He and another guy swam back with the bodies to meet the kids' parents. To this day, I think about the sensations he must have gone through to get this done. What a brave man. This is a 100% true story that my friends and I have been telling for quite some time. 2 of my good friends, we'll call them Tony and Jimmy, stayed over at my house in 2006 when we were 16 years old. We have an older house, built in the early 1960s by an amateur architect who included some really cool, outrageous designs. The piping in the house is identical to that required for industrial buildings, as well as the wiring, etc. Bit of a unique house. Anywho, Tony, Jimmy and I decided to go down into the game room to watch The Exorcism of Emily Rose on our home theater system. We start the movie at 8 or 9 p.m., watch it all the way through with minimal interruptions, and then promptly fall asleep afterwards. We weren't freaked out by the movie in the slightest bit. I should take this time to reference the portion of the movie where they claim that 3 a.m. is the ideal time for paranormal things to happen. This has been a long-held belief among the superstitious and super-religious. We were unaware of this at the time, and simply thought it was a made-up Hollywood thing. Tony sleeps on the only couch in the game room, while Jimmy and I sleep on the floor. Everything is going peachy at this point, and I fall asleep without hesitation. Suddenly, I woke up. I lie there for a moment, pondering the day ahead of me. Wow, wouldn't it be creepy if it was 3 a.m. right now? I look down at my cell phone. It's 2:57 a.m. I laugh to myself and put my head back down on the pillow. As I'm drifting back to sleep, I wake up to a horrible scratching sound coming from one of the windows. The game room is halfway underground, with a door at the end of the room leading out to the outside patio. This is where the windows are. Anyways, I wake Jimmy up as quickly as I can and point towards the window. He's still rubbing his eyes and going, "What? What's your deal, man?" The scratching starts again. Jimmy's face turns white, and I start to freak out even more at the sight of him getting freaked out. We both got up and slowly walked over to the window. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. The scratching suddenly stops. We're about a foot away from the window at this point. We were completely silent when suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Tony sit up from the couch. "Tony, did you hear that?" We both turned to him. His eyes look like they're rolled back into his head and he's not saying a word. Tony used to sleepwalk and have night terrors when he was a little kid. His dad had told us quite a few stories about him running around the house screaming and crying while he was still asleep. So anyways, I shook Tony's shoulder and said his name again. Much to our dismay, he starts mumbling something like, "and she said she didn't want to, but he wanted to, and he made her do it." He repeated this twice before slowly. The way he did it couldn't have been any creepier, lowering himself back down onto the pillow and closing his eyes. Jimmy and I shook him for a good minute before giving up and running upstairs into our well-lit kitchen. We didn't sleep that night, and we still get freaked out about it to this day. Tony swears he doesn't remember anything, and it always freaks him out when we bring it up. So, that's my scary story. After moving into a new apartment, my son was complaining he couldn't sleep because something wouldn't leave him alone. It kept coming through the wall under his window and bothering him. After several nights of complaints, I sent him and my wife to the living room. I calmly spoke about leaving my son alone. He needed his sleep, so let him sleep. My son never said another thing about it. One late night I was returning home with my wife and son. He was our only child at this point. We were all wide awake, and as I pulled into our parking space I could have sworn I saw a man standing next to my child's bedroom window in what appeared to be a hat and a long coat. I said nothing in front of my son but told my wife about it later that night. Almost 3 months later, we were coming home about the same time of night, and as we pull up to park, my son mentions that he saw a man in a hat and coat standing next to his window. My wife and I both instantly looked at each other and got goosebumps. Another odd occurrence involving my eldest son was when he was around 1 year old. My wife walks into his room one night after hearing giggling when he should be sleeping and sees him standing in his crib smiling. She asks him what he was doing, and he says, "Talking Papa Victor." Papa Victor had passed away a few months before he was born. A friend of mine has a friend who was driving through the Mississippi extremely late at night. He was making his way through a backwoods 2-lane highway, the kind of road where you would only see another car once every 15 minutes. He noticed a car stopped in his lane about a quarter mile in front of him. He slowed as he got near it and could see that the driver's side door was open, and a man was lying motionless on the ground beside the car. He slowed down more as he got even closer. He had an instinct to stop and check on the guy because no one else was around and he could need medical attention, but something didn't feel right. He decided to pass the stopped car and maybe park further in front of it. As he passed the car he looked in his rear view and saw the man who was laying in the road slowly get up. Then roughly a dozen people came out of the woods on either side of the highway. It was an ambush party, waiting to jump someone that would stop to help the, supposedly, injured person. This is apparently common in South American countries. Makes me cringe. Also makes me never want to help anyone. At least not in the middle of the night. My family and I were vacationing years ago, and one day we decided to stop and take a look at some old Indian cliff dwellings. You could even take a trail and walk around in them. We decided to do this. As we were looking around, a middle-aged woman wearing a ranger outfit showed up. She was a really helpful and friendly lady. She told us all about the cliff dwellings and answered all of our questions. She even entered a restricted area to let us touch some ancient artifacts normally off limits. Eventually we moved on, we said goodbye and left her in the dwellings. A short while later, we realized that the path would take too long to complete. It was getting late, so we decided to turn around and come back the way we'd come. Now, it's important to note that the trails around here are very narrow, with steep drop-offs and high walls on either side. This is not a trail that's easy to get off of. As we entered the dwellings again, the woman was nowhere to be seen. We simply assumed that she had descended the trail earlier, since late in the day it was getting. When we finally reached the trailhead, we asked a group of hikers resting there if they knew anything about the trail guide we had met earlier. We wanted to express our gratitude towards her for being so helpful. The hikers, however, informed us that they had not seen such a woman. We were all suddenly very creeped out. There was no way that we could have missed her on the return journey. Unless she fell to her death, there was simply no way. They went on to say that no park rangers work here during this day of the week. I'm not sure how creepy this may be to somebody who wasn't there. One October night a few years ago, I had just arrived at my friend's house, and we were playing video games in his room as the sun was setting. Suddenly, we hear this horrible, blood-curdling screaming outside. We nearly hit the ceiling from being startled. We rushed into the living room and peered cautiously out the front windows from behind the shutters to see nothing but the dimly lit street and my car parked at the curb. We tried to put the event out of our minds and went back to playing video games for another half hour. That's when my friend got a knock at the door. He went to answer it and I stayed in his room, but he called me to the living room. As I walked into the room, there were 2 police officers at the door asking us about the screaming. We asked them if anything had happened, and they said that they had asked a lot of people on the block and only the people whose houses were on the right side of the street had reported hearing the screaming. We told the police officers about the abandoned house a few doors down and they said that there were officers already searching for it. That's when I glanced out of the window and saw that there were a lot of police on the scene. I decided to head home after the police officers had left. Night has fallen already and there are no street lamps on this road. I had packed everything up and was walking out to my car in the pitch darkness. As I was about to open the gate and leave, I heard the screaming again. I ran to my car as fast as I could and bolted out of the area. It might have been fear, but I swear that when I was running to my car I heard footsteps behind me. We never heard anything about what had happened or even heard the screaming again. But, to this day, I always try to leave his house before nightfall. Long ago last year I was on vacation with my best friend and his family at Dumont Dunes, essentially sand dunes in the so-called desert. It was the middle of the night, and I awoke to a clamor outside the RV. I was sleeping at the very side of a slide out, so I hear every time. I awoke to the sounds of motors and people screaming that someone had been run over and was dead. I looked outside and saw not a single light. I dismissed the adrenaline and went back to sleep. The next day I heard the same thing, motors, screaming, and death. I figured it was my mind reacting from the night before. Fast forward a year and I was in a trailer with my girlfriend's parents in Lake Habas. We were sleeping on the Monday night of Ye holiday weekend, so Jet was practically dead in campgrounds minus our trailer group and a few others far down. I awoke and heard the same thing, motors, screaming, death, and tears nearly verbatim from at the dunes. The sound was still there and sounded like dirt bikes and other off-road vehicles. There was none, just a deserted campground. I still have not a clue what happened, nor why my mind is repeating this to scare me. I used to work at Circuit City in my first year of graduate school before it was liquidated. We had this one fat nerdy guy with a weasel-sounding voice. Being a fat nerdy guy, I tried not to judge him on this. But something seemed off about him. He was always spending his time on the break room computers during his lunch break. Well, one day it turned out that he didn't show up to work. The store director was reading the local paper in the break room while a few of us ate lunch with him when he just stood up. Sorry guys, got to go call corporate. It turned out that the creepy computer salesperson had just been formally sentenced on child charges and the store director read it in the paper and had to go tell corporate and ask what he needed to do. Creepy guy no longer had a job after that because he failed to disclose he was under investigation during the initial interview process, and nothing showed on the background check because he'd not been convicted yet. The judge gave the creepy guy a few days to put his affairs in order, and he came into work for some reason. He seemed pretty shocked that the company didn't take lying on your application well, nor did it want him selling computers to families when you had a child conviction. Once we started reviewing the footage, it got pretty uncomfortable in how he had looked at some kids and we had never really noticed. Moved into a new house about 18 months ago, the end of the house where I live is about 200 years old, with a very creaky corridor and stairwell outside my bedroom door. As I'm a university student, I spent my first week in houses last Easter, about 2 months after my parents had moved in. For the first week I kept being woken in the night by someone walking down the corridor from my parents' room to the toilet outside my bedroom, which was adjacent to the longest wall of my bedroom. This wasn't just footsteps, but as anyone who lives in an old house will know, you can feel the floor move when someone is walking around. Annoyed, I asked my mom why she wasn't just using her ensuite. My parents' bedroom is about 20 meters from mine, separated by the corridor mentioned. She just laughed and said I was probably hearing things or wasn't used to the noises the new house made. When I came back in summer, I started to get the feeling of being watched, as I'm sure everyone has experienced, but this was different. I have never believed in the supernatural, always looking for a logical reason, but this was horrible. I didn't just feel like I was being watched, but I could tell, and describe, exactly who was watching me, without ever seeing anything. My bedroom door opened onto a stairwell in front of it, and whenever I went to the toilet at night I could feel a young girl, in a white nightdress, watching me, just peeking over the top of the stairs, between the banisters and the corridor above. I also had the exact same feeling when in my kitchen at night, that a little girl was watching me from the doorway. Towards the end of summer I had what must have been a dream where I woke up in the night and saw this girl sitting on the chair in my bedroom, looking at my TV, which was turned off. If I focused, I couldn't see her, but when I squinted she became more apparent, and would occasionally turn to look at me. This girl seemed in no way harmful, but it's still creepy to never see anything but be able to know exactly what is watching you. About 1 month ago, whilst my parents were away, I was in bed home alone when I woke up feeling extremely cold. Again, I felt like I was being watched, but this time it was different. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I put my covers over my head. I should mention here that I'm a 22-year-old guy who has never been scared of the dark, used to messing around in forests etc. as a child and has never felt scared. Again, even though I was facing away, with a cover over my head, I just knew what was watching me. It was an old woman standing over my bed, just watching me, and I could visualize her perfectly. Last weekend I went home to see my grandparents etc. for my 22nd birthday. Whilst at their house, I saw a picture of the woman I knew had been standing over my bed. As it turns out, it was my great-grandmother. I'm guessing I had seen this picture before and visualized it subconsciously, but I have never been scared of much and refused to be alone in this house, always having friends round. It's one thing to feel like you're being watched, but when you just know, and can visualize exactly who is watching, it is freaky. One night I had a seriously upsetting series of dreams. Well, they were upsetting at the time, but occasionally I'll talk to my best friend about them, and we'll try to figure out what they mean. Anyway, here they are as best as I can remember them. A little over 7 years ago, my senior year of high school was beginning. The night before the first day of class, I had a series of 3 dreams that are unlike any I've had previously or since then. At the time, I'd get anxiety before the school year started, so I'd usually sleep out in the living room with the TV on to calm me down. So, I fell asleep and had my first dream. I was in an apartment complex that I used to live in as a kid. I felt like I was playing a game of hide and seek, so I ran to a place in the apartment to hide. I remember ducking behind a balcony and 2 kids, I guess the seekers, ran by. I felt good that I avoided them, so I backed out of the balcony area and ran the opposite way they were running. I headed back towards the mailroom when I heard "I found you" behind me. I turned around and I saw myself. As a kid. About the age I would have been when I lived in the apartments. I don't remember saying anything in my dream, but I do remember the younger me saying, "Now you'll have to catch me," and he ran away. I chased myself around a building and by a wall when I finally caught up with me. I reached out and was about to tag my shoulder when I awoke. The TV was still on, Nick at Night. Always put me to sleep, and I wasn't completely freaked out, simply confused. I managed to go back to sleep relatively quickly. Dream number 2, this time, I was in the house I lived in at the time, but I was in my room. Everything was where I remembered it being, so I went outside and headed towards the bathroom. I saw a dim light emanating from underneath my parents' bedroom door, indicating that their TV was on, which is how they usually slept every night. I got to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. Nothing was out of place. That's when I heard a TV off in the distance, so I made my way to the source of the noise and saw that it was in the living room, and there I was, sleeping on the couch. I thought this was weird, but I looked at the TV. It was Nick at Night, and the time was around 5:40 a.m. on the VCR, under the TV. I went over and tried to get a better look at my face while I was sleeping, but as soon as my dream hand met my sleeping body, I woke up again. Significantly more freaked out this time, I sat up. I noticed the time on the VCR was 5:41 a.m. I don't remember how, but I managed to go to sleep once more. This time, it was the worst of the 3. Dream number 3, I was in a dark room. It felt like a circular room, but I couldn't see anything. I started walking in one direction and saw what looked like a cage or a gate, and when I looked around from there, I noticed 2 gates. One to my left, and one to my right. One was golden or glowing slightly, and one was dark and gray. Almost charred. I started walking towards the golden one, but I got a really uneasy feeling. Something was wrong. I felt like something was calling me towards it, so I turned around and ran towards the charred gate. I felt as if something was chasing me, but I never saw or heard anything. I remember reaching the gate, opening it, and then waking up. And here's the worst part, after I woke up, I sat up and then felt a hand on my shoulder, as if someone grabbed me. I jumped off of the couch and couldn't sleep, couldn't shower, anything. It was the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. I know it's not paranormal, but recounting these dreams always gives me chills. I swear it was a hand grabbing me, but it was after I woke up. Anyway, if anyone has some insight to whatever these could mean, it would be useful. These aren't normal dreams I have. About 5 years ago my friend's brother Tim and his friend Andrew were driving through a highway in Delaware late one night. After a while they noticed that the car in front of them always stayed exactly the same distance from them. They thought this was odd, and it freaked them out a little, so they decided to coast for a while, and of course the car in front slowed down too. At this point, they were getting freaked and decided to inspect the car ahead of them, and all the markings on the car were scraped off except for 2 letters on the license plate, a black O, and a green M. Besides that, all they could say was that it was a red compact, possibly a Toyota, and that the driver seemed to have long stringy hair. Everything about this situation seemed bad, so when the road came to a curve they decided to stop and wait for a while. After what they told me felt like about a half hour, they proceeded around the bend and OM was there at the same distance ahead. It now became evident that they were being stalked from in front and that this could turn out really bad. They decided to play it cool, and eventually the highway forked into 2 roads and OM went in the opposite direction. After the event, Tim and Andrew did research and learned that the name OM has significance in Buddhism and Hindu. It then became clear that all this happened because earlier that day Andrew angered a Tibetan monkey. I heard this story for the first time in my first year of high school in Southern California and thought it was nothing more than a ghost story. 2 years later, during my junior year, I was doing homework while listening to the radio and they mentioned a murder in the neighboring county of Riverside. The only witness mentioned seeing a car leaving the scene and the license plate had a black O and green M. 2 people I know got stalked by a serial killer in Delaware 5 years ago. And then same guy killed someone near me 3 years later. Bricks were shot. My mother got up early one day, the day after my aunt died. She went into the kitchen and enjoyed the beautiful sunrise while she started to smoke and put the pack of cigarettes on the counter. The pack of cigarettes lifted up and was hurled across the room, sending the cigarettes all over the floor. My mom died of lung cancer 3 years later. Her sister always told her to quit. The second story is after my mom died. She used to have a help bell on the end table beside her. When she rang it I would come to help her, or she had something to tell me, when she was really weak. One day I was in the dining room, and heard the bell violently ringing. I thought it was my mind and waited 5 minutes. It continued ringing and my dad asked me why the bell was ringing. I ran downstairs to find the bell in its place beside the bed. Another incident was my mom's music box, which randomly started playing in the middle of the night, has been broken for years. The last story was at a close family friend's cottage. Once everyone was asleep, the furniture on the deck was being moved. I then heard steps slowly come up the stairs until the door opened slowly. I had already turned on my iPod and looked towards the wall. Someone seemed to be shuffling their feet in the middle of the room. I was frozen in fear, frozen. I felt a burning sensation of someone watching me. I sat like that for 8 hours until I heard steps heading downstairs. I was the only one on the top floor. I only heard the other stories afterwards. My family friend slept there once, after her son had died. He was like a brother to me. She heard the same thing except she heard a basketball being dribbled on the floor. When my friends came with us a year after my incident, I didn't tell anyone this story as of yet. They heard footsteps coming upstairs and the door opening to the room across the hall, where I was a year previous. I told them the story / and the family friend after the fact. I don't know 100% if the paranormal exists, but I have experienced some creepy things in my house. My grandpa / grandma / sister have had experiences after family has died, but they say the encounters were too personal and they won't talk about it. I swear this is true. I would never use my mom's death to benefit myself and my claims. So, this is the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me. When I was younger, I lived in a rural area of the Midwestern U.S. My house was fairly isolated and situated in a thick forest. This house was also full of windows, which was beautiful most of the time, but other times pretty creepy. I am the oldest of 3 sisters, and at the time I was in 6th grade or so, with one sister in 4th and the other in 1st. One Saturday morning, my little sister woke me up to tell me that there was a funny-looking man at the front door. I looked, and sure enough, the guy was there, looking into our little peephole. He was a bit unkempt, and it seemed like he knew we were there. Perturbed, as our mother wasn't home to answer it, I just told her to ignore him and pretend we weren't home. She called me into her room a while later, as she needed help lowering her shades, as she was going to change out of her nightgown. While next to the window, which bordered the forest on the back of the house, the man's head suddenly popped up on the other side of the window. Screaming, we ran to one of the only rooms without windows and fetched the other sister. I grabbed the landline phone and, there was no dial tone. No nothing. Someone had cut the lines, and we couldn't even call our mom. As we were small kids, we had no cell phone, and if we did, we probably couldn't even get a signal. Scared, we devised a plan to get help at our neighbor's house, which lived a bit down the road. The only danger was we had to find a way to walk in the open, outside of the forest, without being seen by the man. Sobbing, we grabbed mops, brooms, anything to defend ourselves, on our trek to the neighbor's. Arriving there in a frightened heap, she went to the house to check it out. He was already gone, but he left a card on our door, notifying us that he was doing some electrical maintenance on our house. So, it turns out this guy was just working on the house, and my mom forgot to inform us of this. Still, it was creepy. From the ages of 10 to 15, I lived in suburban CT, just over the border from NYC. I'll let you guess where, specifically. We owned this really cool house, done up in classic colonial style, but with modern amenities and design inside. It sat on the corner lot where the street made a sharp bend around a rocky bluff that actually counted as my front yard. Though our house was fairly modern, most of the other homes in the neighborhood were far older, some dating back to the early 1900s, and one dating back as far as the late 1800s that seemed incredibly out of place, but since it was marked a historical place by the city, none of the owners had been able to update it. As such, anybody who bought the place for years to come would almost immediately move out after realizing that the magic of owning a piece of history would quickly be outweighed by the burden of having to deal with the historical society and having to maintain what was essentially a rundown cabin. From my bedroom window on the second floor, and only during the winter when the trees were dark and bare, I could see the old house and could watch the repetitive drama unfold month after month. Strangely, most of the people who moved into that house were young professional couples, stuffed to the collars of their Ralph Lauren polos with naivete, believing that they would be able to renovate a century-old piece of American history without trouble. In the 5 years I lived in that house, I had seen a good 8 to 10 families go through, some with children my age with whom I became fast friends. Now that I recall, it may not have been my award-winning personality which attracted them to me, but their burning desire to just get out of that house if only for a few hours. Stefano was really the only one I remember with much detail, as this particular story mostly revolves around his experiences in the home. His dad was a historian for the local museum and nature center, really awesome place where you could swim with otters, who had accepted an offer to live in the house, short-term to determine whether or not its history was rich enough to turn it into a self-contained exhibit. Oh, and he was incredibly Italian. I mean fat, jolly, homemade salami-making, body hair of a Wookiee, fugged-about-it Italian and a really cool guy in general. One of those adults that never speaks to kids like they're lower than him and always willing to tell awesome stories about what happened in and around our town. So, Stefano's dad asks my parents if Stefano can sleep over one night so that they can go to a fundraiser for the Historical Society. My parents agree. Stefano brings over nearly every toy and video game that he owns, and yet somehow we just end up playing Star Fox 60 for the entire night. His parents get home around 1:30 and call my parents to confirm that they're alright and ask if Stefano is doing alright. The parents have mindless small talk for a few minutes, hang up and go to bed. At 2:30, as I'm getting ready for bed, I glance out the window and notice a weird flicker from the direction of Stefano's house. At first it looks like headlights turning into a driveway, then I realize that it's fire of some sort, dancing through a square window that faces my house. Steph, do your parents have a fireplace? No, my dad's rebuilding the chimney, it was sealed to keep out the snow and stuff. No, I mean there's fire coming from your house, man. Look. He leaps up and runs to the window, stopping only for a moment to take in what he's seeing. The blaze is unmistakable at this point, though there doesn't appear to be much smoke coming off of it. We both ran downstairs, and I shook my mother awake who, upon hearing the story and knowing that I would not make up something that terrible, leaped to her feet and grabbed the phone. As she's dialing the number, she walks upstairs to my window to grab a view of the fire. She's staring right at the fire. I very distinctly remember how the orange glow reflected off the wet leaves strewn throughout the stretch of forest between our houses and off my mother's face as she called Stefano's parents. They pick up. Jules, are you alright? Are you at home? My mother practically screamed, addressing Steph's parents. The rest of the conversation I caught only brief snippets of, trying to listen in on my mom's conversation while Stefano was starting to sniffle a bit, worried about his parents. Essentially, they were home, but they were perfectly fine and didn't understand what it was we were talking about. They had turned the lights off and gone to bed nearly 2 hours ago and had not lit so much as a match. They said this so hurriedly and hung up so quickly that my mom felt terrible that she had awoken them so late at night for what was clearly the overactive imagination of a preteen. She spent a few minutes rationalizing how the flame, which was still perfectly visible, though fading, was probably just a reflection of another neighbor's fireplace or deck lights. The tension had gone from the situation and had left both Stefano and I emotionally drained and suddenly fully aware of how tired we would be at 4:30 in the morning. We passed out in our sleeping bags. This next part, I remember so incredibly vividly, it surprises me. I remember waking up to the smell of pancakes. My mom always used to make pancakes when my friends slept over. I woke up lazily at first, but when I realized that Stefano was already up and packed to go, I jumped up to go say goodbye. I ran downstairs to find both of our parents in the kitchen, my mother preparing the pancakes and my dad talking with Stefano's mom and dad. Stefano was sitting in the adjacent living room, N64 controller in hand but with the game paused. It became clear that he was listening intently to what the parents were discussing, so I grabbed a seat on the couch and listened as well as they were clearly unaware of our proximity. Stefano's dad moved quickly to the matter at hand. When you called last night, what was the deal? My mom replied, I was standing in Tracekill's room, watching your house on fire. You were, specifically? You saw it yourself? Yes, absolutely. Though I guess it was just a reflection or something. No. Listen, I'm sorry for hanging up on you like that, we had a rough night too. I don't think that house is fit for people yet. We may be moving to the split level down the street until we can finish the exhibit. The rest of that sentence was completely drowned out by the resounding no it began with. Did Stefano's dad just confirm that the house actually was on fire and then completely move on like that was a normal thing? 3 months later, they became the last family I would witness moving out of that home. He did, however, stay roughly in the neighborhood, and became one of my closest friends. We would hang out all the time, playing video games and riding our bikes down to the deli to grab a sandwich. We entirely forgot about what had happened until the day the exhibit was opened in the old house. Stefano's dad invited us to come see it before the Historical Society came through. It was honestly incredible. His dad had done a fantastic job refinishing the floors, having the windows and other exterior decoration pieces replaced by local craftsmen with years of experience. There were plastic sign holders all over the walls explaining how the house had belonged to several influential writers, had been used as a hideout for bank robbers during the late 1800s and had once been extended into a makeshift church during the Great Awakening. The only thing which stood out was the fireplace, which was as crumbled and dilapidated as it had ever been, the only noticeable difference being the absence of the hearth, which I had assumed was removed to make way for the new flooring. It wasn't. As I read the plaque that hung next to the fireplace, the room went black, and I felt as if my eyes were retreating into my head. In 1922, a woman had used the home to start a small grammar school for busy New York businessmen's children. They were allowed to stay at the home, in one of the 2 guest rooms she had packed with a total of 8 beds. They were fed 3 warm meals a day, were taught grammar, diction, manners, and general education and were permitted 3 hours of play outside for exercise. This was what the parents were told. In actuality, the woman only graduated around 3 or 4 classes before she started burning the children alive. Since most of the children were too young to write, and their well-to-do parents were probably too busy to read anything from them anyway or take interest in their well-being, she managed to torture and burn nearly 50 children this way. The only reason she was eventually caught was because the vaporized fat rising with the smoke of the children's bodies had deposited itself on the branches of the trees overhanging the house and had started to smell terribly. She was arrested and then disappears into obscurity. The investigators recover enough clothing and jewelry belonging to the missing children to charge her, but her conviction was apparently sealed by the discovery of dozens upon dozens of charred bones interred beneath the hearth. After Halloween about 12 years ago, while playing a Ouija board, with my older brothers and some of their friends, we had asked the spirit we were talking to, George Wash N where he called himself, we asked what had happened to our Nintendo 64 game, GoldenEye. George told us to look in our basement, which floods every winter, due to groundwater. There was about 2 feet of water, dark and pretty large room. I was too scared, but one of my brothers floated across the water all the way to the other side of the basement in a gardening muck bucket, to find our game down there, with nothing else. Just the game on a stand. We thought one of us is rigging the Ouija board and playing with us. I personally thought it was my brothers. So, we go back and ask George Washan were some more questions. We asked him who were our friend, Ryan's, real parents, as he was adopted. George Washan were named his parents and told us all that they had died in a car accident. We had never known before that, and it had only been hinted to our friend Ryan, who was only 12 then. He made a call and went home crying. Always tripped me out, won't forget that. I was working as a mechanic in Dublin, Ireland, close to the River Liffey in these tunnels that old Dublin buildings seem to come equipped with. Our tunnel was in need of a pointing but structurally okay. It ran directly away from the river, under the building up to the point where it was bricked off with newer, i.e., within the last 100 years maybe, bricks and mortar. Our shop would store new bikes in there on 2 long racks. You would build up the bikes and stash them into their spot in the tunnel until they were sold. You could enter the tunnel from either end of the shop, the front or the back, and there was maybe 75 to 100 meters between the entrances. The mechanics normally used the front, and sales used the back. First thing in the morning, assuming I was the first mechanic in, I would have to feel my way about halfway down the stairs and reach and flip on the lights to the tunnel, which for some reason not wired to be wired from the ground floor above. Pain since the tunnel was really dark without lights. So, it was felt, switch, go to work. I felt, flipped the switch, and I am staring at a guy simply standing there in my work area. I was not in the slightest bit afraid. Bizarrely, I just looked at him, and he 100% failed to acknowledge my presence in the slightest. So, I am standing there, blink, he's standing there, no reaction from either of us. I would like to say I was being brave, but I was just baffled. I think at some point I said something. Again, no reaction, complete stillness. Then reasonably quickly but casually, he turned, and walked away down the tunnel away from the river towards the new bikes and the sales entrance. I was still halfway down the stairs and at this point had become vaguely irritated by the whole thing, assuming he was a thief despite his remarkably unflappable behavior. I popped my head up and shouted to the manager of the place that there was someone in the tunnels. He immediately ducked down the far entrance to cut him off. I followed our hero down the tunnel, picking up the heaviest adjustable spanner in the place on my way. The manager and I met in the middle of the tunnel. In fact, neither of us saw him from the instant he walked in there. There was frantic searching by me, but it's tricky to hide in a rack of bikes. Not a massive amount of searching can be done. I looked at the bricked up end to see if it was still there, and it was the same as ever. None of it made sense. A bit later we were having our morning coffee and cakes, and I was talking to the lads about it. None of them were interested really. I kept on bringing up the biggest scandal I had uncovered in the shop. Yes, it's the ghost. But ghosts don't exist, smiley face. Mum. None of them were interested in talking about it. All of them independently said the same thing. It was the ghost and that was all there was to it. Conversation closed. And it was closed with a firmness that left me in no doubt no one was keen on the subject. It was never brought up again. No jokey haha, gotcha. Just total indifference. The interesting part of it was I never considered being scared, or that the person looked ghostly. It just looked like another person, that simply should not have been there, behaved strangely, and then vanished. Afterwards even I was not creeped out, just annoyed that what happened was clearly impossible. Once I was a carpet cleaner, and a lot of our customers were people who had just purchased a new home. One time I was on a job with my coworker Jason, and it was the last job of the day. The house was an old farmhouse out in the boonies in Fowlerville, Michigan. We were hired to clean the carpets throughout the house, some of which were new. The young couple that apparently had just purchased the house were messing about in the kitchen. The house wasn't furnished at all. Note, for those not familiar with how carpet cleaning goes, after you're done steam cleaning, you use this sort of rake device to fluff up the carpet to eliminate the footprints and marks of where your cleaning wand has passed over the carpet. I was in a second-story bedroom which was connected to another bedroom by a walk-in closet. I was just about done raking the room when the coffee I'd been drinking all day caught up with me. I went to the bathroom and came back. There were footprints in the carpet where I had already raked coming from the closet area. I assumed that Jason had come upstairs, walked through the other bedroom, and checked to see my progress while I was in the bathroom, but he wasn't upstairs at all. He was still working on the den downstairs. So, I walked over and re-raked that area again, and raked back over my prints as well. Then the power went out. Apparently, the couple also had an electrician over and they were working on adding an additional circuit for the garbage disposal they were putting in. The lights came back after only a few seconds, with a cacophony of sorry, coming from downstairs. The footprints were back. I walked back and raked them again, and as I walked towards the hallway, I was done with the room by that point. I heard somebody chuckling in the closet, so I yelled back, "Ha! Very funny. I'll just have you redo it then." And then I hear Jason from downstairs yell, "What?" This is the point where my hair stands up on my neck and a chill runs down my spine. Hello? Then I see two footprints abruptly appear in the carpet outside the closet, like someone has just stepped out of the closet and was standing in the room facing me. I dropped the rake and ran downstairs. I yell at Jason on the way out the door, "I'm going to have a smoke." I can't seem to get the footprints out of the carpet upstairs. What? Next thing I see is the bedroom lights going on in the rooms upstairs and Jason comes outside. "What the hell, man? There are tracks in all the rooms. Did you try to rake them out?" "Yeah, I did a quickie job, but geez, why didn't you finish it up?" he says accusingly. "Go check it again. I'll bet they're back." He sighs and rolls his eyes and goes back in. I see the lights go on and off quickly upstairs. Jason, out of breath, comes back outside. "What is that? Did you do that, or is someone messing with us? Gimme a smoke." We decide not to go back upstairs, and quickly finish the rest of the job up. When we were settling the bill, I hinted to the new owners there might be something strange happening in the house, and the wife turns to her husband and says, "I told you." 2 years ago, I was 18 and going to my last year of camp. My cabin decided to go up to this supposedly haunted graveyard in southern Minnesota, in the Spirit Lake area. We parked our van and walked about a quarter mile to the graveyard. A 45-year-old firefighter named Joe accompanied us on the hike. When we got to the graveyard, nothing out of the normal happened, and after about 20 minutes, we walked back to the car. When we got there, we realized Joe was not with us, so the two of us walked back to the graveyard yelling his name the whole time. After 20 minutes, they got back to the car and there was no sign of Joe. We were really freaking out at this point, and then out of nowhere Joe was just there. He had a blank look on his face and didn't have any explanation for where he was, and he just wanted to go back to camp. When we got back, he started to cry for a good 10 minutes. We eventually got him to tell us what happened, and he said that he was frozen in place. He was right by us the whole time but couldn't move. He could see and hear us, but we couldn't see him. He also said that a ball of energy was moving between our feet the whole time and that a mist was above our heads. He was 100% serious, and I will never forget the look on his face. When I was working doing insurance restoration cleanup, we had a job come in where a septic pump stopped working in the basement of an incredibly old house. This caused his first floor hallway bathroom to back up and leak poo water from the bathroom down into the basement. So, my job was to clean all of that up. The basement was super creepy. But the basement isn't where this story takes place. I've provided a quick diagram of the part of the house this happened in. The home I was in is one of the first homes built with indoor plumbing and natural gas in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was built by the family that owned Virginia Natural Gas. Most of the house had historical plaques under portraits and on original fixtures. The front door was one of those items. We were told not to use the front door because it was the original door with all its original hardware and always stayed locked. I had finished all the cleanup in the basement and was just finishing the cleanup in the hall bathroom and had started to take my moisture readings. I set my clipboard down on top of the dehumidifier with the front door being in my peripheral vision. I leaned down to pick up my moisture meter, and when I stood up, the front door was wide open all the way on the back of its hinges. I can only imagine it took half a second to bend over and pick up my meter. This 100-plus-year-old door unlocked and opened itself without making a single noise. There was no one else in the house but me and the owner's dogs up on the third floor. I walked up to the door and closed it and relocked it. It was heavy and made old wood/metal noises as I closed it. I shakily headed, gathered my things and returned to my vehicle, where I contacted the owner of the house and told him exactly what happened. He said that they have lived in the house for 4 years and have never experienced anything supernatural. Even authoring this story down has caused the hair on the back of my arms and neck to stand up. I was in about 4th grade, so about 9 or 10 years old. One of my neighbors had moved in a year prior and still had a friend of his come visit every so often. Somehow they got on topic about a myth book they read that had different beasts and such in them, and the one they were talking about in particular was named Seafarer. They described as half man, half goat. Apparently there was a mad scientist who was doing some kind of experiment on a goat and ended up merging bodies with it, keeping the lower half of the man and upper half of a goat. It had blood-red eyes and could run 100 miles per hour. They also say that he likes to eat people, especially people who form a hoofprint in the knuckles of their fingers when fully extended. This weirded me out because of the 3 of us. I was the only one who could do this. But still, I'm thinking to myself, yes, okay, I'm getting a ton of BS from these 2 fools. That night we spent the night at my friend's house and somehow got back on the topic of Seafarer. My friend went on to say that his brother even saw seafarers here in our neighborhood. Both of our houses have a clear view of a park with a hill, and that's where he saw Seafarer, the hill. Again, I said yes, right, and they wanted to see if we could see him again. We set up a telescope in a room looking at the hill and we saw nothing for like an hour, which was a long time when you're young, so we gave up. We are about to go to sleep when I see that one of my friends saw another friend's mom leaving their house, to which he says, "Oh man, Goatman's going to get her." So, he's looking out the window some more and then he claims he saw seafarers run by. We started looking again and, of course, saw nothing. The next morning, we were actively riding our bikes. There are bushes on the opposite end of the park with a few spots where if you ride through you get a decent amount of speed. One of the 2 other guys must have fallen or something because he crawled out of a bush. This is when we all somehow at the exact same time find a hoofprint in the woodchips. We all thought it was a coincidence and continued to ride. Later though, we found another hoofprint in the grass not too far away from the first and near a walking path. Now we started to think about it, and investigated some more, but found nothing. Still thinking it was a coincidence, we again continued riding. Then, out of nowhere, we find a letter from an attraction board that businesses use to advertise their sales and whatnot, like McDonald's. We started to find more. When we couldn't find any more, we decided to try and see what it was supposed to say. Not believing our eyes, we stared at the letters with our mouths on the ground. It spelled out exactly the word Goatman. As crazy as that was, I still don't believe anything like this is real. And I never found or heard of anything dealing with seafarers since I'm 19. When I was 5 and my brother was 4, we lived in this house we now call the Bad Luck House. We had a cat that had a litter kitten. Somehow they all got wedged behind some dresser and died. My brother said he even saw Satan outside of his bedroom window at night. Let's just put it this way. Weird thing went down. I swear this really happened. My brother and I were outside eating at night and looking at lights. All of a sudden this Frankenstein-looking man walked up, grabbed my food, the top of his head flipped open like a garbage can lid and he dumped my food in there and then left. I went crying inside and told my mom what happened. She said I was surprised and that I had to go to bed. I was done fibbing. 3 days before Christmas the whole house ended up burning down. That is when we finally got the hell out of there to never return. I do not generally post, but this story is too appropriate. To start, I would like to clarify that I nor my parents believe in the paranormal generally, but when I was about 5 to 8 we lived in this really oddly constructed house that I'm confident was haunted is some format. There was a tiny door in the back of a closet that led to a large room accessible to small children. An ordinary seeming room closest would have a discreet passage to other rooms. Not super relevant, but just want to get across, this house was weird. What was particularly odd about this place is you always had the sense you were being watched, just that prickly uncomfortable sensation. The horrific moment came when my older sister was taking a shower upstairs. We heard a crash, then screaming, and ran to find her covered in shards of glass and bleeding from a multitude of wounds. She was irate at me for hitting the glass with my hand, and she was adamant about seeing a hand hit the glass. It certainly wasn't me, and I had been with my father at the time. It is one of the sliding glass doors on top of a bathtub/shower. It was thickly paned and sturdy. Later, we tried to sell the house, and whenever someone was inside viewing it, extremely loud noises occurred, like someone was hitting our copper pipes with something metal. It was a noise that only happened when viewers were taking a walk around. Anyways, I've never experienced anything like that and generally don't believe paranormal stories when I hear them, but this was different and is honestly making me uncomfortable to think about. Last night I was hanging out with friends, having a few drinks, eating pulled pork, and chatting about Breaking Bad tomorrow. We had been hanging out for a while now, so everybody came and said their goodbyes, hugs and kisses were exchanged. Now, I always get uncomfortable when I am left alone in my apartment. My roommates have girlfriends that live nearby, so they always spend the night there, so I always leave the living room light on, just to make it feel like someone could be home. Anyways, everybody leaves, and as I close the door, the light bulb in the living room gives out and my apartment is in utter darkness. I run to the kitchen to grab a light and I see a shadow that's just outside my window, given off by the streetlight. I live on the first floor. I grab an umbrella, walk over to the window, and it's a man taking a massive thing right outside. He sees that I had taken notice, grabs some paper towels that he has, and tries to pick them up, but it is far too mushy to hold its form. Even now, there is a massive turd laying in front of my apartment to remind me to always get light bulbs. I can take a picture of it soon if anybody would like. I and a friend have organized a trip down to Texas to hunt for fossils. We pull off the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, gather the gear we need, and begin hiking into the forest. It takes us some 20 minutes to get to the area we're going to hunt fossils. Along the way we come across a clearing. In the middle sits an old twisted tree, and scattered all over the area are animal bones. Now there were not piles and piles of bones, but you could see 4 or 5 skeletons scattered about. We both think this is weird, but we continue deeper into the forest until we reach the area we were going to search. We spent most of the rest of the day searching the area. We find a few good fossils, vertebra, teeth, a few bones. We decide to pack it up as it is getting late in the evening. On the hike back we passed by that same clearing, but this time we avoided it. We spent several minutes hiking, and we ended up back at that clearing with that old, twisted tree in the center. Now both me and my friend are former army. We spent most of our time in the field hiking through brush, navigating with maps, so this shouldn't be happening. We corrected ourselves and we started hiking again. A few minutes later we ended up back at the clearing, so we're starting to freak out. There is no way we could have messed up twice. The sun is starting to go down, so we know we have to get out of there, so we fix our bearings again and begin to hike out one at a time. So we go in a straight line. Several minutes later we approach a clearing, but with the light failing we can't see into it. When we finally exit the tree, like we see that same twisted tree, but now there are vultures sitting on it. I break down, fall to my knees, and shout, "Please, we're sorry we disturbed you, let us leave." After that me and my buddies start hiking out. Just before the sun disappears beneath the canopy we manage to find the road we parked on. We sprint down it to our van and haul out of that forest. We have never gone back to that site to hunt fossils. I have a friend who claimed his house was haunted. He said a demonic-looking figure would walk into his room on some nights, get on top of his bed and crouch down and stare at him. He said he could feel it. This is sort of different than SP, considering most people just have the figure by their bedside or out of view. But there's something that is even worse. On certain nights, he'd hear some sort of screaming outside of his room. So, he'd physically get up, which is obviously not sleep paralysis, and walk down his hall to the top of his stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, he'd see a man with a knife in his chest screaming and looking at him. My friend said that he was covered in blood and was sort of engulfed in the darkness. Scared, my friend would just go back to bed and try to sleep, but still hear the screaming coming from the hall. It'd take a while, but eventually it'd all just stop. He said he never built up the courage to go to the bottom of the stairs and see if the man was really there. I'm fairly sure he has moved out by now, and I think he's had to see a therapist about it. It was Halloween night, and I was at a friend's party. One of her sisters asked me if I wanted to go to the attic and use the Ouija board. I said sure, because I just thought it was a toy. So, we were up there alone, and the thing started moving and I didn't think I was moving it, so I thought she was doing it. I don't remember what all we asked it, but it started doing something on its own and it spelled out, not spelled correctly but well enough to understand, "Here comes that Deanna who was the girl's sister." Not 2 seconds after the last word, Deanna reached the top of the stairs. We both freaked out and took our hands off it, and it kept moving. We put our hands back on because we thought that was a sad thing to take our hands off, but then we pushed it off the board. I know this sounds crazy, but personally, I will never touch one again. Also, I live in the house I grew up in. As a teenager I saw an orb move from the ceiling to floor in my living room, thought it was my eyes. Then I looked through the house and I saw it move from floor to ceiling in the back room. More recently, I have been awakened at night twice this year, by being poked. Once on my foot and once on my knee. As a teenager my mother and I moved into a new house, in 2008, that was built by the original owners in 1949. My mother is the second owner of this house, so Mr. and Mrs. Jacques lived there for many years. And Mr. Jacques died of a heart attack in 2000. I moved into the house after my mother did, since I stayed with my father that summer, and so I never got to see the house before she bought it. Needless to say, I knew we weren't the only ones living in the house, especially when I needed to go do laundry in the basement. Mr. J was a carpenter, he had a workbench in the basement, which was still covered in his meticulously organized tools, and he built just about everything in the house. So, it was kind of expected to give off a creepy feeling when I went down there. It would have been fine if that feeling wasn't as strong as it was. I knew he was still working at his bench, even after death, and when I asked my mother if she felt it too, she told me I was imagining things. A few months later, I kept seeing strange humanoid shadows walk by my room and go into the basement. I could see the basement door and my mother's bedroom from my room. I even saw the shadow look at me angrily before slamming my mother's door. I went up to my mother after this started happening and told her straight out that I was seeing Mr. J. She then confessed that she knew he was still here and that she saw him the day she looked at the house and her best friend saw his shadow in the corner one night. Apparently she lied so I wouldn't be afraid of the house. As if that would scare me. Anyway, Mr. J got used to us living in his house and became less angry and more friendly towards us. Our cat loved him. Maybe the cat was getting played with and loved from Mr. J while we're not looking? Who knows? He even started showing less as a shadow and more as a full-body apparition to me. One night, he wouldn't let me sleep. This was the first night he decided to show himself to me. It was like I was looking at a living person. He had a smile on his face, and I could see him clearly as day. It was like he was standing there right in front of me, and he looked tangible, like he was still alive. I took one good look at him, a little bit in shock, and then turned back around to face the wall and tried to go back to sleep. He then blew in my ear, and when I turned around, he was kneeling next to my bed, smiling at me. I gave him a WTF look and turned back around. Once again, he blew in my ear, so I turned around again and told him to let me sleep. He gave me another smile and then vanished. On Christmas Eve, my mother and I both heard him walking up and down the stairs and working at his workbench. He built the cedar cabinet downstairs for his wife one Christmas as a present. We're thinking he was reliving that memory. I still see him at least multiple times a week, and we're thinking that the Jacques owned a cat. You know that distinct feeling of a cat jumping on the bed next to you? Well, we felt that, looked up to pet our own cat, just find no cat there and are sleeping somewhere else in the house. I've even seen the cat use the kitty door to go into the basement multiple times. It gets rather strange at my mother's house sometimes. I was standing in my bathroom with my sister, we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for bed, and I thought, out of the corner of my eye, that my dad walked by the bathroom on his way to his bedroom, which is the only room at the end of the hall. I didn't say anything, but a couple seconds later my sister yelled out, "Dad?" I guess she wanted to ask him a question, but when he didn't answer she asked me if he was mad at her, and maybe that's why he didn't answer. I said I didn't know, but that I saw him walk by too. We both walked out and looked down the hall. His door was closed so we opened it and looked in, calling his name, but no answer. We called down to my mom, who then tells us that nobody is home but her and us. My sister and I looked at each other to confirm that we both saw a dark shape walk by the door, and just assumed it was my dad. She's never seen anything like that before, but when I was younger, in the same house, we've always lived here, I used to see black figures out of the corner of my eye when I was playing piano, and it used to make hate going into the living room to play. And worst of all, when I would sleep, I'd wake up and see 4 black figures standing around my bed, shaking it. For most of my childhood, I couldn't sleep. I'd go to bed early while everyone was awake, and when I'd wake up at night, usually around midnight or 1, I'd turn on my light and read until 6 a.m. when my mom woke up, when I'd then go back to sleep. I still live in the same room, but thankfully no more black figures bother me. I am haunted. Not my house. Not my room. I am haunted. When I was little, my parents moved us out of San Jose in the early 90s. At the time, San Jose was a small agricultural town, but it was growing, and crime was a problem, so they did the sensible thing and moved out. We moved to Selma, California, in Kings County. We moved into a 2-story Victorian-style house. The local children called it the Addams family house because, well, it's what it looked like. It's been several months since the move-in date when things started happening. My mother, at the time, had a collection of antique hat pins. For you younger kids, women in the olden days wore tiny little hats as a fashion accessory, but they could only stay on with the help of hat pins. So anyway, my mother's hat pins are going missing, and she and my father are looking for them. My dad finds them. They were in the furnace duct. In the living room there was a huge furnace duct, seemed huge for a kindergarten, which dropped into the basement in a huge furnace that would heat the house. My dad crawled in and grabbed them out for her, and I was blamed for it. The residents of Selma would always stop us if we were out. You live in that haunted house? Or other variants of you bought that haunted mansion? When my brother was born, I was in school. When he was about 2 years old, my mother told me that he came downstairs from the room we were sharing crying, telling her, "The girl won't share my toys." My mother was all, WTF, thinking that the neighbor's girl invited herself in the house again. She went upstairs to kick her out, no one up there. She asked my brother to describe the girl he was playing with, and the description didn't match the neighbor girl. Neighbor girl was Vietnamese. I remember, very clearly, my father tucking us into bed one night and before closing the door freezes has his eyes open wide. Years later he told me about a young girl with blonde hair and a nightgown was standing in between mine and my brother's bed glaring at him. We moved out of that house soon after and hadn't had anything happen until this current house. We moved to and settled in Shafter after moving from Bakersfield. During high school is when everything started happening again. I remember, when I used to share a room with my brother, we would see our door gently swing open. Like someone was standing in the doorway playing with the door like you would do if you were watching your kids. He and I are sitting on the floor getting our killer instinct on when we start fighting with each other on who's the better player. Boys will be boys and all. I started noticing that the louder we got, the more the door would open and close. We both saw the door close, swing all the way open and slam shut as if someone were trying to get our attention. Our mother ran down the house wondering why we were slamming doors. She didn't believe us. Another in this house that I remember, my great-grandmother died of stomach cancer and I needed a new mattress. So, I got the mattress that she died on. Every night for 2 years I would be rudely woken up from my bed being shaken violently. In the kitchen, when my mother would cook dinner, she would hear her grandmother's voice call her by her nickname. One night I couldn't sleep in the summer, so my bedroom door was open, and my parents weren't. Our rooms are right next to each other. On the left is my parents', on the right our room, and in the middle of the hallway is the bathroom. I saw a shadow leave my parents' room, walk past my door, and into the bathroom. I lay frozen in my bed wide-eyed waiting, hoping that it was my mother going to the restroom. The bathroom light never came on and the shadow never came back. The shadow person showed up when I started doing magic in the house. The parents added 2 rooms to the home. A bigger living room and a bedroom for them so my brother and I wouldn't share rooms anymore. I got their old room. One day I'm sitting in my futon playing with my dog. Silly boy in dog game. I'm sitting on my futon, and I am forced to lay on my side. There were nights where I would lay in bed and hear a woman screaming in my left ear. And then all activity stopped. I was deployed to Kosovo, and I had the night off. My roommate and I the night before watching Paranormal Activity, and so, for giggles, and because I was bored, I put on my headphones and fired up the program Audacity. I hit the record button and said, "My name is Specialist A. Vanderpool. Is there anyone in this room with me tonight?" I waited 30 seconds before continuing. "I would really love to get in contact with you." I waited 30 seconds and stopped recording. I played it back. I heard my voice and a 30-second pause full of white noise. I heard my voice again, "Would love to get in contact with you." Followed by a man's whisper, accented in Slavic, "We love that you're trying to get in contact with us." Being a skeptic of ghost stories, here's one I like that originates from my hometown. In the 70s, a young couple go out to enjoy a film. When they come out, the guy realizes his motorbike has been stolen. His girlfriend lives in town, so he offers to walk to her home, and being a gentleman refuses to stay the night, this being only their second date, and says he'll just walk home as his village is only 2 miles away. So, he starts to walk at the side of the old Roman road heading out of town when it starts to rain, heavily. He folds up the collar on his coat in an effort to stay dry and soldiers on, carrying his helmet under his arm. About a minute later, a car coming from behind him violently swerves as it passes him, almost crashing in the process. The next day, the local paper has an eyewitness account from an elderly gentleman, saying he saw a headless ghost, on account of the folded-up collar, carrying its skull underarm, the bike helmet, walking along the old Roman road. 2 years ago, my friends and I were trick-or-treating around my neighborhood. If you think of it as a horizontal rectangle, my house is on the left end, and where we were was at the right end. So, it's about 11 p.m., and then it starts pouring hard. My friend goes home, and I start walking home. It's raining really heavily, so I don't want to walk all the way upwards towards the street, all the way across the neighborhood, and then down towards my house. I figured that I'd walk through the center of the neighborhood, where there's an elementary school. So, I reach the elementary school, and I start walking around it. At this point, I was behind it, walking towards the right front side. I'm walking on the outskirts of the field that they use for recess. In the middle of this field is a figure, hunched over, with a dog on a leash. Both of them are completely silent and not moving. The dog's ear wasn't even moving an inch. This really freaked me out. Why is this person standing in the middle of this field, where there are no houses around, by the way, with her dog, at 11 p.m. on Halloween night, while it's pouring? It wasn't even as if she took her dog out to take a poop, because like I said, there were no houses around the school. So, I'm pretty freaked out. I keep walking though. As soon as I was on the other side of the school, she'd be out of sight. I'm silent as I walk, and she's facing away from me. Then, without warning, she abruptly and sharply turns around and stares right at me. Her gaze doesn't go away from me. As soon as I turned that corner, I hit 6th gear and dashed all the way back home. I don't believe in ghosts/demons or supernatural stuff of any kind, but goddamn, that was scary. When I was 14, I went to stay at my uncle's new house in Kent. He's a doctor and he'd moved into this old farmhouse with his family. It's a huge house and nice inside. However, I noticed that at night when I went upstairs to my room, I was never comfortable with staying in the long hallway that took me there. Think of a long dark hallway which has a shining sequel level of foreboding about it. I couldn't really think why it was, so I managed to just avoid spending time there. Anyway, my room was at the end of this hallway, and the door to it was old and the latch didn't work, so it couldn't be closed fully, but at night I would wake to hear it creak open. There was never anything there when I brought up the courage to look, so I took to wedging it closed with a bag. One night, after a particularly weird dream about feeling hands reaching under the covers and grabbing my feet, I really hope it was a dream. I really needed a pass. Fortunately for me, the toilet was exactly opposite my room. I stepped out and looked down to the far end of the hall where there's a large window and there was nothing there. I went in the bathroom, did my business, but as I left the bathroom I got this terrible feeling of dread, and couldn't look towards the window. I ran back in my room. I couldn't explain it at the time, but 6 months later we returned for my cousin's christening, and the priest had been invited to bless the house. I thought it a little strange and asked my mom why he had been asked to do so. She told me that when they first moved into the house, my uncle had woken up in the night to go to the toilet too. On his way back, the hallway was filled with dense smoke. He thought there was a fire initially, but the smoke detectors didn't react. When he looked towards the end of the hall, there was a man, smoking a cigar, looking out the window illuminated by the moonlight. My uncle bricked it, ran into his room, and called the police after waking my aunt up. He then went out to confront the man, but there was nothing in the hallway, the smoke and man had completely disappeared. He hadn't told anyone but my mom and dad, so it wouldn't freak me and my cousins out. Essentially, the priest did an exorcism on the house. In a skeptic over ghosts, but my uncle is a reasonable and educated man. I'm worried because I found out that someone got murdered in my new flat. I grew up in a small town with 3,000 people in Wyoming. My friend lived on a ranch outside of town, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor is a half-mile away. One night, his mom woke up in the middle of the night and heard breathing beside the bed, and even though it was dark, she thought she could make out a human figure. She started poking my friend's dad, trying to get him to wake up but doing it discreetly without alerting whatever was beside her. Eventually he started and mumbled something and the person beside their bed yelled. Everyone started screaming and the dad grabbed the pistol he kept next to the bed. Whoever was beside them ended up running out into the night and their fields. They chased after him, but never found him. A few weeks later, my friend and his family were getting ready to go to church. They'd gotten in the car and driven for about 10 minutes when my friend's sister realized she'd forgotten something for Sunday school, so they turned around and went back. When they went into the house, they heard running water and looked in the bathroom. The sink was running and was full of whiskers, someone had just been shaving. They called the sheriff, and they searched all the rooms but didn't find anyone, but then my friend remembered the attic. The sheriff went up and found a sleeping bag, a pillow, and eventually found a man hiding in the corner. Apparently, the man was homeless and had been living in the house for about 2 months. He would come down at night and grab food and use the bathroom, and sometimes when he couldn't sleep, he would sneak into my friend's parents' room and just watch them sleeping. This is absolutely true, and it happened about a year ago. I was working in a haunted house in Tucson, getting it ready before opening weekend. I was carrying a couple long 2x4s and working my way alone through a section of the haunted house called Side Effects. Many of you may recognize the building itself as the slaughterhouse John Travolta stole pig's blood from in the movie Carrie. Well, the building itself has been all but condemned for decades, especially after a string of violent deaths, the latest of which involved a hydraulic press lift malfunctioning and crushing a worker against the ceiling. So, this particular night, I was making my way with the lumber towards Side Effects when I saw a shadow through the doorway on my right. I knew I was the only person in this section, because Side Effects was done and everyone else was working on another part of the haunted house. The shadow moved away from the doorway, and I heard the telltale, high-pitched whine of an old TV being turned on. Within 2 seconds, I was at the doorway, able to see inside. The room was empty. I could see, from the doorway I was standing in, 50 feet down both well-lit paths out of the room. No one was in there and there was nowhere they could have hidden. A single TV on the wall of creepy-ass TVs we had built was slowly coming on, right near the hydraulic lift that I mentioned. I immediately called John, the proprietor of the haunted house, into the room and showed him the TV, which I hadn't taken my eyes off of. John was as taken aback as I was. He immediately reached down to a stray electrical cord and plugged it into a wall switch. The TVs all turned on in unison, then turned off as he unplugged it again, including the ghost TV I'd seen. John told me, none of these TVs are plugged in. I don't know how that one came on. Nope. I left the room at that moment and didn't come back until opening night, when the crowds arrived. I have a picture of the room somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. When I was about 11 years old, I was vacationing with my family in the Turks and Caicos, a small island in the Caribbean. At the time of year we were visiting, there was some sort of bioluminescent algae in the water that was visible at night, and the island locals would take the tourists out on boats to see the natural phenomenon. Anyway, my parents decided to take me and my brothers out to see the glowing algae. These tours were fairly late at night, and by the time the tour boat docked, it was around 11 p.m. Being the 11-year-old idiot that I was, I proceeded to carelessly run ahead of the rest of the group on the way back to the parking lot because I wanted to be the first one on the bus. But when I got to the parking lot, it was completely dark, no lights were on, and the bus wasn't even there yet. I was surprised by the unexpected darkness, so I turned around to head back to the rest of the group, when suddenly a dark figure grabbed me by the arm and started questioning me. "Where are you going?" It was a man's voice. I was confused about why he was grabbing me, but I was young and stupid, so I was too scared to resist. Instead, I told him, "I'm waiting for the bus." "Which bus were you on?" "I can't remember. You were on my bus, weren't you?" At this point he begins to start pulling me away toward a van, and at that very moment, the parking lot lights come on and the rest of the group of tourists turns the corner. He quickly let go of my arm and stepped away from me. I look at his face and see that he is an extremely disheveled-looking man, probably around the age of 50. He has a scraggly gray beard and a startled look on his face. I immediately walk back to the group and see that the man is trying to walk away as casually as possible. My dad asks me, "Igloo 444, what did that guy want from you?" And I just said, "I don't know." At the time, because I was young and naive, I was completely unaware of how unsure the situation was. It wasn't until much later that the memory returned to me and I fully realized how lucky I was and how close I had come to something truly terrible happening to me.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.